man fell into a chemical vat in a California mountain base and came out as a god. He spent the next decade building an army from other people's bodies. He had a plan for humanity. Nobody asked for it. Welcome to a quiet journey through one of the most ruthless figures the Fallout Wasteland has ever produced. Tonight is not about the battles. It is about the people behind them. The ones in laboratories, in boardrooms, in sealed underground facilities, who made decisions that ended the world and filed those decisions in alphabetical order. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from tonight. And if these calm explorations of wasteland history are something you return to, make sure to subscribe so the next one finds you. The fluorescent lights at Mariposa Military Base in California were still running the day Richard Gray fell into the FEV vats. The FEV, or Forced Evolutionary Virus, a biological agent developed to produce enhanced soldiers for a war the government refused to end. Gray was a researcher. He was not supposed to be near those vats without protection. The records of what happened next were sealed, then lost, then partially recovered in fragmentary form across terminals that still flicker in the ruins today. What emerged from that chemical bath was no longer Richard Gray. Something assembled itself from the biological wreckage over years of slow transformation, absorbing other organisms, expanding, thinking in patterns that no human brain was built to follow. It called itself the Master. The hum of old machinery carries through the lower corridors of Mariposa even now, decades after the army that base produced was scattered and destroyed. The Master was not designed to be a villain in the conventional sense. His ideology was constructed with genuine internal logic. He believed that super mutants, created through forced exposure to the forced evolutionary virus, represented the next stage of human development. And he spent decades building infrastructure around that belief before anyone on the surface understood what was growing beneath their feet. The Children of the Cathedral, a religious organization operating openly across the West Coast, was never what it appeared. It was a recruitment network. It was a delivery system. The faithful were being guided, quietly and patiently, toward the vats. What separates the Master from nearly every other figure in the Wasteland's long catalogue of cruelty is what happened when he was wrong. When confronted with evidence that his super mutants were sterile, that his entire vision of the future was biologically impossible, he did not deflect, did not rationalize. He destroyed himself. A figure who accepts the truth is, in its way, more unsettling than one who never could. The dry air of the Mojave carries dust from one basin to the next, but the particular weight of the Capital Wasteland is different. Heavier, grey, carrying the taste of irradiated stone and broken concrete. The F that consumed Richard Gray was not his invention. Hundreds of miles east, at the Vault-Tec research facility in what is now the Capital Wasteland, a team of researchers had been refining the forced evolutionary virus for years before the bombs fell. Their goal was military enhancement. Stronger soldiers, reduced casualties, a biological answer to a conflict measured in decades rather than years. The terminal entries that survived at Vault-Tec record hundreds of human trials. The language used in those entries never changes. Results were logged. Variables were adjusted. The suffering of the subjects was noted as a data point and reclassified as an acceptable condition of the research. The facility itself was eventually destroyed in the nuclear exchange. The virus was not. It had already been transported to Mariposa, already been introduced into water systems, already begun its long migration through every corner of the wasteland. The worst thing Vault-Tec ever produced outlasted every person responsible for producing it. That is not an accident. That is the nature of what was built there. Pale light filters through collapsed ceiling panels across what remains of Vault 87, deep in the Capital Wasteland. The structure was never meant to function as shelter in any meaningful sense. Vault-87 was designed as a continuation of Vault-Tec's work, a facility where FV experimentation could proceed after the surface became uninhabitable. Its residents were selected not for their skills or their temperament, but for their biological suitability as test subjects. They were told they had been saved. Over time, in stages carefully documented by the science team stationed within, they discovered what saving them had actually meant. The mutations logged at Vault 87 produced a strain of super mutant distinct from those created at Mariposa. Larger, more aggressive, wired differently at a behavioral level that researchers noted with the same detached tone used to describe weather patterns. The science team did not survive long after the experiment reached its conclusion. Their terminals remain. Several entries stopped mid-sentence. What ended those sentences was never recorded by anyone left to record it. Beneath the surface of the Commonwealth, far below the ruins of what was once Boston, the Institute operated in sealed silence for generations. The recycled air carries a chemical flatness that never fully leaves the lower levels, no matter how many decades pass. Father, the name given to Sean, the biological child of the sole survivor, was taken as an infant and raised entirely within the Institute's walls. By the time he became its director, he was an old man who had spent his entire life inside an institution that treated the surface population of the Commonwealth as a variable to be managed. His cruelty was never theatrical. It was administrative. The Railroad, an organization dedicated to freeing synthetic humans, was dismantled under his authorization. Surface settlers were replaced by synths, synthetic humans engineered to be indistinguishable from the real, without the knowledge or consent of the communities affected. Father's arguments, when he finally made them, were not without internal logic. The surface was violent. The Institute had advanced capabilities no surface faction could match. He had reasons. The reasons existed alongside decisions that treated living people as raw material. And he never appeared troubled by holding both positions at once. In the end, what made him so difficult to dismiss was that he was not performing certainty. He had simply arrived at it and had never been given sufficient reason to leave. The wind at Big MT, the Big Mountain Research and Development Center in the Mojave, moves through ruined laboratory structures with a low, continuous tone, as though the facility itself is still processing something it cannot name. Dr. Mobius was once a full member of the think tank, the collective of disembodied scientist brains that continued operating at Big MT long after the Great War rendered the surface uninhabitable. He is, at first encounter, presented as the facility's primary threat. A rogue researcher responsible for populating the surrounding terrain with dangerous roboscorpions and opposing the broader research agenda of his former colleagues. The reality recorded in his personal terminals is considerably more complicated. Mobius deliberately cultivated the appearance of danger because he was the only member of the think tank who understood what would happen if the others were ever allowed to leave. His ruthlessness was worn as a costume. Beneath it was the only functional moral awareness left in the entire facility. Dr. Klein, who led the think tank in the period Mobius was attempting to contain, removed his brain from his body before the bombs fell. The decision was framed as a practical one: continued research without the interruptions of physical maintenance, hunger, fatigue, or eventual death. What was also removed, though never acknowledged in any terminal entry, was the framework through which harm was registered as harm. Klein and his colleagues proceeded to conduct experiments across the Mojave Basin, on animals, on plant life, on the occasional human subject, with the detached curiosity of researchers who had permanently insulated themselves from consequence. His particular category of cruelty was obliviousness. He caused suffering on a significant scale and never processed it as suffering, because the part of him capable of that processing had been placed in a container and left on a shelf. The cazador, the mutated tarantula hawk wasp that made the Mojave Basin among the most lethal terrain in the wasteland, was not a natural development. It was designed. Boris, another member of the think tank, layered venom concentration, flight speed, and behavioral aggression into the creature's biology, with the precision of someone who had thought carefully about the outcome they wanted. He also produced the Night Stalker, a hybrid of rattlesnake and coyote engineered for ambush effectiveness, and several other creatures that were released into the surrounding region without containment protocols. The terminal entries Boris left behind at Big MT describe, in passages that sit between biological notation and something more personal, a childhood defined by social cruelty. The Mojave's most dangerous fauna exists because one researcher remembered being treated badly and had access to a laboratory. Personal history converted through institutional resources into ecological permanence. The dust of a Washington boardroom settles differently from wasteland dust. It carries paper, carpet fiber, the residue of meetings that shaped everything that followed. The Vault-Tec executive board did not design a single experiment. They authorized all of them. The sociological trials, the population reduction programs, the medical procedures conducted on residents who believed they had been granted survival. Their headquarters in Washington, D.C., is referenced in records scattered across multiple regions. And the scope of their planning is examined most directly in the Fallout television series, where the full architecture of what they built becomes visible. They did not merely intend to survive a nuclear war. Evidence preserved in their records suggests they calculated that a controlled catastrophe was preferable to an uncontrolled one, that they possessed advanced knowledge of what was coming, and that their preparations went considerably beyond shelter construction. Whether that evidence represents the complete picture remains deliberately unclear across the historical record. The ambiguity, perhaps, is its own form of answer. One figure within that infrastructure carried the board's logic to its quietest and most patient conclusion. Bud Askins, whose Buds program is documented in the records of Vault 31 beneath the Los Angeles wasteland, designed a cryogenic preservation system for Vault-Tec's most loyal corporate personnel. The program was not violent. It required no weapons, no force, no confrontation. It simply froze the right people and waited. The executives sealed within Vault 31 were preserved alongside the ideology that had shaped every decision they had ever made. The belief that resources belonged to those positioned to manage them, that populations existed to be administered rather than served, that the period of rebuilding would require exactly the kind of leadership currently sleeping beneath the California ruins. The horror of Bud Askins is not found in anything he destroyed. It is found in what he arranged to survive. He was ruthlessness as institutional continuity. The cruelty of a man who ensured the same framework that produced the catastrophe would be the first thing present when the catastrophe ended. In the end, what connects every figure in this opening chapter is not hatred. None of them hated the people they harmed in any simple or legible way. What they shared was certainty, the settled, unexamined conviction that their work was necessary, that the cost was someone else's to bear, and that the distance between the laboratory and the consequence was sufficient to keep the two from ever truly meeting. The scientists built everything that came next. The generals were the ones who picked it up. He crucified people along the road so travelers would see them before they saw anything else. That was not cruelty for its own sake. That was policy. That was a man who had studied history, understood persuasion, and decided that a body on a cross communicated more efficiently than any spoken warning ever could. The dry air of the Mojave carries heat in the afternoon and cold at night, and almost nothing in between. The fort, Caesar's Legion encampment, on the eastern bank of the Colorado River, sits in that in-between quality permanently, a place that feels neither settled nor temporary, as though the ground beneath it is waiting to see what happens next. The roads approaching the camp are marked by wooden crosses. The crosses are rarely empty. Edward Sallow was not born into power. He was educated by the Followers of the Apocalypse, a humanitarian organization dedicated to preserving pre-war knowledge for the benefit of post-war communities. He read deeply. He studied the patterns of collapsed and rebuilt civilizations. He understood, perhaps better than anyone alive in the Mojave, what Rome had actually been. Not the idealized version, but the functional one. The version built on conquered populations and administered through organized terror. He encountered a group of tribal people in the Mojave and recognized in them the raw material his reading had prepared him for. He renamed himself Caesar. He renamed them his legion. The tribes that refused absorption were incorporated by force. The ones that resisted too long were destroyed. His arguments, when he made them, were coherent. He had read the history. He chose the most brutal interpretation available and applied it without hesitation or apology. Philosophical cruelty is the hardest kind to argue against because every counterpoint has already been considered and filed away. The camp beyond the river is quiet in the hours before dawn. Dust settles on canvas and on stone and on the wooden posts that line the perimeter. Caesar's most effective instrument was not a weapon or a policy. It was a man. Legate Lanius was recruited into the legion after Caesar's forces destroyed the tribe Lanius had belonged to. The entire community gone, replaced by the organization responsible for ending it. Lanius accepted the offer. He rose through the legion's ranks, not through political maneuvering, but through a capacity for violence so consistent and so controlled that it became its own form of authority. He led from the front. He executed legionaries who failed missions as readily as he executed opposing soldiers, which meant his own forces were as motivated by proximity to him as by any loyalty to the cause. At Hoover Dam, positioned at the legate's camp above the river, he waited as the legion's final military commander. He can be turned back through argument rather than combat, through the observation that the legion's supply lines are extended beyond sustainability. That option exists. What it reveals is a strategist beneath the iron mask. He was not operating on instinct. He was choosing every time to be exactly what he had become. Across the wasteland, the ruins of Pittsburgh carry a different weight entirely. The pit sits in a grey industrial haze that never quite lifts. The air thick with particulate from mills that were running before the war and are running still. Ashur was a brotherhood of steel paladin, a soldier trained in one of the most disciplined military organizations in the post-war world, who was separated from his unit during a mission to the pit and who decided not to go back. What he built from the ruins of Pittsburgh was a functioning industrial settlement, the only reliable source of steel in the surrounding region, sustained entirely through the labor of an enslaved population. He justified this arrangement on utilitarian grounds. The output benefited the wider wasteland. The alternative was collapse. The suffering of the workers was a temporary condition on the way to a better outcome. His wife, working in the medical wing of the settlement, was genuinely attempting to find a treatment for the Trog mutation, a degenerative condition affecting much of the pit's population. He loved her. He also held hundreds of people in forced servitude. Both of these facts coexisted in him without apparent conflict, which is what makes Ashur so difficult to place in any simple category. He is not a monster performing decency. He is a man who built something genuinely useful on a foundation he refused to examine. The Capital Wasteland's slave trade did not operate only in the pit. Paradise Falls, a settlement constructed within the ruins of a pre-war shopping center, functioned as the region's primary market for human captives. The collapsed roof sections let in grey afternoon light. The cages were positioned where the storefronts used to be. Eulogy Jones ran Paradise Falls with the composure of someone who had never once experienced a moment of doubt about his profession. He dressed carefully. He spoke pleasantly to visitors. He administered the acquisition, transportation, and sale of human beings with the same organizational efficiency a pre-war merchant might have applied to any commodity with stable demand. What is most unsettling about him is the absence of any internal framework that would classify what he was doing as requiring justification. He did not argue for slavery. He did not construct an ideology around it. He practiced it because it was profitable. And profitability was, in his accounting, a complete moral answer. His operation extended to Little Lamplight, a settlement populated entirely by children, where he periodically attempted to acquire new inventory. The records of these attempts were kept in the same ledgers as everything else. Beyond the Capital Wasteland, in the Commonwealth, Nuka World sits at the end of a monorail line that still functions, which is somehow the strangest detail about it. A theme park that survived the collapse, still accessible, still lit in sections, now occupied by 3 raider factions, dividing its territory by agreement. Coulter held the position of overboss through a modification to his power armor that connected it to the park's electrical infrastructure, making him effectively unkillable within Nuka World's boundaries. He maintained authority through spectacle, a gauntlet that challengers were required to survive, and almost none did. He had no agenda beyond retention of the position, no vision, no ideology, no plan for what Nuka World would become. He was defeated not at the story's conclusion, but at its opening, which is itself a statement about what kind of threat he represented. The raider economy beneath him was the actual structure. He was simply the face pressed onto the front of it. Faded signage still hangs above the park's interior corridors. The neon that remains operational casts color across surfaces that have not been cleaned in 200 years. Mason led the pack, one of Nuka World's 3 raider factions, through a philosophy organized around biological hierarchy. The belief that status was determined by the capacity for dominance, demonstrated through competition and the deliberate cultivation of fear. He kept living, death claws penned near his territory. He wore trophies taken from creatures he had killed personally. The performance was genuine in the sense that Mason believed in what it communicated, that the pack occupied the apex position in any environment they entered. What the performance obscured was the administrative competence required to maintain a functional faction inside a contested theme park. He directed violence productively. He managed personnel. The savagery had a budget and a schedule behind it. The wars of the Mojave and the Capital Wasteland were post-war conflicts, built from the materials the collapse provided. General Jingwei's war was older. He commanded Chinese military forces at Anchorage, Alaska, during the Sino-American War, the resource conflict that preceded the nuclear exchange. And his final stand at the Anchorage front became the subject of a Brotherhood of Steel memory simulation, a preserved recording accessible in the Capital Wasteland decades after the events it depicted. Within that simulation, Jingwei refused surrender past the point where any rational military assessment would have demanded it. He executed officers who recommended withdrawal. He held the line through personal authority and the credible application of lethal consequences for failure. His terminal records reveal a commander who was aware the position was lost and who chose continuation regardless. Not from confusion about the tactical situation, but from a form of pride so complete it had become its own operating system. His cruelty exists at a strange distance, preserved in a recording rather than in the wasteland itself, which gives it the quality of something studied rather than encountered. real enough to have been worth preserving, distant enough to be examined without cost. The ruins of Project Purity, near the Jefferson Memorial in the Capital Wasteland, carry the stillness of a place where something important was stopped before it could be completed. Colonel Augustus Autumn operated from Raven Rock, the Enclave's primary installation in the Capital Wasteland, and served as the organization's senior military commander during the events documented in the region's historical record. He was defined, above all else, by his relationship with institutional authority, a relationship complex enough that he was willing to override the directives of his own commanding officer when those directives conflicted with his judgment. He administered a lethal agent to the scientific team at Project Purity without hesitation when the situation required it. He pursued his objectives with patience and with considerable resources. He was not cruel in any personal sense. He was professional, which in his context meant the same thing. His tragedy, insofar as it exists, is that he served an organization that had already concluded the world was not worth preserving in any form a living person would recognize. Far from the Capital Wasteland, off the Pacific coast, the Enclave's oil rig rose from the ocean in isolation. The platform was the last seat of pre-war governmental authority, and it produced, through its own experimental programs, the most efficient instrument of destruction in its inventory. Frank Horrigan was a soldier before the Enclave subjected him to forced exposure to the forced evolutionary virus. What emerged from that process was still shaped like a person, but no longer operated as one. He was deployed across the wasteland to address threats to Enclave operations. The mission records that document his deployments use the same administrative language applied to supply requisitions and maintenance schedules. Communities were removed. The language never changed. Horrigan expressed no distress at any point in the recorded history of his operations, which is not because the distress was suppressed. It is because the process that transformed him removed the framework through which distress was possible. He is, in the end, a product rather than a person. Something was manufactured from a human being, and the manufacturing was thorough. That does not diminish the weight of what he did. It simply means the accounting goes further up the chain than his name. Every tetratory covered in this chapter was built on the same underlying calculation, that certain lives could be assigned a lower value in service of a larger objective, and that the person performing the assignment was never one of the lives being assessed. The generals of the wasteland did not question this arithmetic. They depended on it. Without it, their empires were not empires at all. They were simply violence, which is considerably harder to maintain. The generals took what the scientists had built and turned it into territory. The next figures required neither armies nor weapons. They required only the right information, held by the right hands, at the right moment. Nobody saw the hand. That was the entire point. The warlords left bodies on roads. These figures left nothing visible at all. Just outcomes, quietly arranged, arriving on schedule, affecting people who never learned there was a schedule to begin with. The penthouse of the Lucky 38 casino sits above the New Vegas Strip at a height that makes the lights below look like something spilled and never cleaned up. The tower has been sealed for 2 centuries. The man inside it has not stepped out once in all that time, and the city beneath him has functioned exactly as he intended, which is the detail that matters most. Robert Edwin House predicted the Great War. He calculated the date with sufficient precision to prepare his own survival infrastructure, redirect nuclear warheads away from the Las Vegas Valley through a network of modified defense systems, and position himself inside the Lucky 38 on life support before the first detonation. 200 years later, the Strip's lights are still running. The casinos are still occupied. The Securitrons, his robotic security units, operating on his instructions, still patrol the boulevard. He accomplished all of this without leaving the penthouse, without, in any meaningful sense, being present at all. His cruelty is the cruelty of a man who reduced every person in his city to a coefficient in a long horizon calculation. He has people eliminated when they become inconvenient. He never raises his voice about it. The Lucky 38 is clean. The cost of that cleanliness has been distributed across every person who was not Robert Edwin House, in denominations they were never informed of. Beneath the Commonwealth, sealed below the surface of what was once Boston, the Institute's director's office held meetings that determined the fates of surface settlements, without any surface resident ever being aware a meeting had occurred. The Institute's directorate, the assembled department heads who governed the organization's operations, made consequential decisions through committee consensus, which meant responsibility for any single outcome was spread thin enough that no individual carried a weight sufficient to feel. The substitution of surface settlers with synth infiltrators, synthetic humans engineered to be indistinguishable from biological ones, was approved through this process. The abduction of Commonwealth residents for use in medical trials was documented in meeting records. The deliberate introduction of instability into surface communities was filed under operational planning. Each department head understood their specific assignment. The full architecture of what those assignments added up to was visible only from above, from a position no single member of the directorate formally occupied. The system was constructed so that accountability, if anyone went looking for it, would dissolve on contact. That construction was not accidental. It was the design. The dry sprawl of the Los Angeles wasteland carries its silence differently from the Mojave's open desert. Wider, flatter, the ruins of suburban streets stretching in every direction under a sky that offers no shade. Hank McLean served as overseer of Vault 33, one of 3 interconnected vaults buried beneath the Los Angeles wasteland, and as the father of Lucy McLean, whose journey across the surface is documented in the first season of the Fallout television series. For most of that season, he is presented as a missing parent, someone to be found, someone whose absence explains the shape of the story being told. The revelation arrives late. He ordered the nuclear strike that destroyed Shady Sands, the capital of the new California Republic. The strike was not an act of rage or desperation. It was a scheduled operation executed on behalf of Vault-Tec's long-term emergent strategy, designed to prevent any surface civilization from accumulating enough stability to challenge the organization's eventual return. He maintained a warm relationship with his children throughout. He attended to their upbringing with evident care. He held a separate moral ledger for everyone who was not his family, and the 2 ledgers never touched. The season ends with him descending back underground, calm, unhurried, already oriented toward whatever comes next. What lingers is not what he did, but how little it seemed to cost him. The ruins of Nipton sit along a stretch of Mojave highway that carries almost no traffic. The town was not abandoned. It was arranged. Vulpes Inculta served as the Legion's primary intelligence operative in the Mojave, and the event most associated with his name is the systematic destruction of Nipton's population. A process conducted not through military assault, but through a structured lottery. Residents were assigned outcomes at random: crucifixion, slavery, release, death. The selection process was deliberate. The arrangement of survivors and casualties along the road into town was considered. Vulpes was not present at Nipton out of any personal investment in its population. He was there to compose a message, using human beings as its medium, addressed to the entire Mojave. Every detail of the scene, who was placed where, who was permitted to walk away and spread the account, was calibrated for maximum psychological impact. He understood that information, properly shaped and delivered to the right audience at the right moment, was more durable than any military victory. The bodies at Nipton were still communicating long after Vulpes had moved on to other assignments. The Tops Casino on the New Vegas Strip carries the aesthetic of pre-war luxury. Chandeliers that still function, carpet that has been replaced within living memory, staff in period clothing who maintain the performance with professional consistency. Benny operated from the Tops as its owner and as the visible face of a scheme aimed at capturing control of New Vegas by acquiring the Platinum Chip, a data storage device containing software capable of upgrading the Lucky 38's Securitron network. He shot the courier at close range in Goodsprings, took the chip and left. The act was clean and efficient. The plan behind it was not. Benny possessed genuine intelligence and a real understanding of how leverage worked at the street level. But his grasp of the deeper mechanisms he was attempting to redirect was incomplete in ways he never fully recognized. He was attempting to puppeteer a system whose full architecture he had never been permitted to see. His nearness to success was a product of his skill. His distance from it was a product of that gap in understanding. He is included in this chapter, not because of the scale of what he accomplished, but because of what he illustrates. That ambition and cunning, without full situational knowledge, produce a person who is dangerous to everyone, including themselves. The Sierra Madre Casino exists in a permanent chemical haze. The cloud, a toxic particulate fog that settled over the villa surrounding the casino before the Great War ended, has never dispersed. It moves through corridors and across open ground with a patient, directionless consistency. And the holographic security systems still operating within the casino respond to movement with the same protocols active on the day they were initialized. Elijah was a Brotherhood of Steel elder before the Sierra Madre became his consuming purpose. He was a skilled engineer, genuinely, not rhetorically, whose capabilities with pre-war technology were substantial enough that his loss represented a real reduction in the Brotherhood's operational capacity when he disappeared. What replaced that capacity was an obsession with the Sierra Madre's infrastructure. The cloud dispersal systems, the hologram emitters, the stockpile of pre-war resources sealed within the casino's vault. He attached explosive collars to the necks of 4 people and directed them through the villa via radio transmission, using the threat of detonation as his primary management tool. His intended use of the Sierra Madre's technology was the distribution of the cloud across functioning population centers. A plan to poison what remained of civilization from a distance, operated by a single person who had concluded that no external accountability was required or desirable. He abandoned subtlety not because he became reckless, but because he stopped valuing the opinions of anyone positioned to object. The interior of Rivet City, the aircraft carrier converted into a settlement in the Capital Wasteland, carries the smell of metal and recycled water. The corridors are narrow. Sound carries unevenly through the steel walls. Dr. Zimmer arrived at Rivet City from the Commonwealth, having traveled across a significant stretch of irradiated terrain in pursuit of a single escaped synthetic human. The unit designated A321, operating under the identity of Harkness and serving as Rivet City's security chief. Zimmer presented himself as an academic. He engaged in polite conversation. He offered compensation for assistance. His position was straightforward. Synths were property belonging to the Institute, and property, when it left without authorization, was to be returned. He made this argument without any visible awareness that the subject of his retrieval mission had developed an identity, a community role, and 2 centuries of accumulated experience that any framework not centered on property classification would have recognized as personhood. He is not theatrical about what he represents. He is simply consistent, which is more troubling than theatricality would have been. Point Lookout on the Maryland coast is separated from the Capital Wasteland proper by a stretch of water, crossed only by a single ferry. The land beyond it is low and wet and full of a particular kind of quiet that does not feel like peace. Desmond Lockhart had been operating in Point Lookout for longer than most of the region's current inhabitants had been alive. He was a ghoul, his physical deterioration a record of pre-war radiation exposure, and a former intelligence operative whose professional instincts had survived intact across 2 centuries of continued application. He fed information to whichever faction's goals aligned with his current assessment of acceptable outcomes, eliminated threats when elimination was the most efficient resolution, and framed every sacrifice of allies or associates as a reluctant operational necessity. He was genuinely useful to anyone working with him. He was also a man whose loyalty to any external party extended precisely as far as his judgment permitted, which meant it could be withdrawn without warning at any point his judgment revised its conclusions. Point Lookout contained genuinely dangerous people. Desmond was the one who had been at it the longest, and who had, through 2 centuries of practice, become the most efficient version of himself. In Appalachia, the mountains carry a stillness between seasons that makes even occupied spaces feel temporarily abandoned. Vault 94, sealed into the West Virginia terrain, held a population that had been selected for a specific purpose. Its overseer understood fully, and its residents did not. The overseer of Vault 94 was given charge of a community assembled entirely from individuals who had been screened for pacifist values. People who, by conviction and temperament, were committed to non-violence as a foundational principle. The Vault's design called for the exterior doors to open after a set period, releasing this population into the post-war Appalachian surface, with the expectation that their philosophy would spread. She knew what the surface was. Her terminal entries do not record any surprise about the outcome. They record a woman who understood the experiment's conclusion before it began, who identified the gap between the Vault's design assumptions and post-war reality with considerable clarity, and who implemented the program regardless. She is a particular kind of puppeteer, one who pulled the strings of a tragedy she had already mapped from start to finish, and who recorded her observations in the same measured tone she had used for everything else. The most durable power in the Fallout Wasteland was never the kind that announced itself. It was the kind that arrived as an outcome, as a consequence, as something that simply happened, with the mechanism behind it invisible to the person most affected. The warlords could be identified and opposed. These figures could not, because the hand was never visible, and the cage was furnished well enough that no one thought to check the locks. The puppeteers managed through knowledge. The next figures required something older, and in many ways more resilient. The one force that operates without evidence, without mechanism, and without any need to justify itself to the people it consumes. A man stood in a ruined cathedral in Los Angeles and told people that suffering had a purpose. They believed him. That was all it took. Not weapons, not chains. Just the right words delivered in a building designed to make words feel larger than the people hearing them. The cathedral in Los Angeles still stands in partial form across the ruins of the West Coast. A structure whose architecture was chosen deliberately, because architecture communicates authority before a single sentence is spoken. High ceilings, stone floors, the particular quality of light that filtered through what remained of its upper windows, falling across rows of people who had walked through irradiated streets to be there. They came because the wasteland offered very little meaning, and the cathedral offered quite a lot. Morpheus administered the children of the cathedral from its interior levels, and his particular skill was an understanding of what the faithful actually needed. not survival logistics, but the sensation of belonging to something that mattered. His sermons provided community, direction, and the specific comfort of believing that one's suffering was part of a larger intention. What those sermons did not provide, and what the organization actively concealed, was the fate of members who progressed too far into the organization's inner structure. Morpheus never administered the forced FE exposure himself. That detail was managed by others at other facilities, by people whose roles in the organization were never disclosed to those descending through its ranks. He was the face. The process happened somewhere the face never needed to appear. The most durable cruelty is the kind that feels, from the outside, indistinguishable from grace. Across the Commonwealth coastline, where the Atlantic fog moves through pine trees and settles over tidal flats, the island holds a different quality of devotion. The air carries salt and the faint chemical trace of radiation that the children of Atom regard not as contamination, but as communion. High Confessor Tectus led the children of Atom on the island with an intensity that made the organization's founder appear restrained. By comparison, his theology was internally consistent. Atom, the force of division, expressed itself through radiation, and radiation was therefore a blessing, a mechanism by which the worthy were separated from those who could not receive it. This framework, followed to its conclusion, required the elimination of Far Harbor's human settlement and the synth refuge of Acadia, both of which represented communities resistant to Atom's division. Tectus advocated for their destruction, not from anger, but from conviction. His faith was genuine. That genuineness was precisely what made negotiation with him so difficult and his presence on the island so dangerous. A performance can be interrupted. Belief of this depth cannot. The Dunwich building sits in the eastern reaches of the irradiated territory, its structure half collapsed, its lower levels accessible only through sections of floor that have given way over the decades. Something about the place does not feel like ordinary ruin. Jarek led a group of raiders who occupied the Dunwich building, and what distinguished them from similar groups operating elsewhere in the region was the nature of their occupation. They had not simply moved into an available structure. They had organized their presence around something they found within it, or believed to exist below it. Their terminal entries describe offerings made in specific locations, behaviors repeated at intervals, a growing orientation towards something below the accessible levels that they had stopped trying to understand and had instead begun to worship. Jarek's own final entries, recovered from the building's deepest reachable point, document a man who arrived at peace through incomprehension. He did not understand what he had found. He decided that understanding was not required. The horror of this is quiet, not the horror of violence, but the horror of a mind that chose devotion to an unknown thing over the discomfort of uncertainty. The coastal city of San Francisco on the West Coast carries the remnants of a different kind of organized belief, one that arrived already packaged, already tested, already equipped with the infrastructure needed to process large numbers of people efficiently. The hubologists survived the Great War and continued their operations with the same combination of genuine conviction at the lower levels and calculated extraction at the upper ones that had characterized the organization before the bombs. Their leadership maintained that a naval vessel docked in the harbor would carry the faithful to another star system once sufficient spiritual advancement had been achieved. Lower-ranking members were required to contribute resources, submit to evaluations, and accept that questioning the doctrine constituted evidence of impurity. The sincerity of the believers at the base of the organization was real. It was also the mechanism through which the cynicism at the top was made operational. The hubologists are among the Fallout universe's clearest illustrations of how belief and exploitation can occupy the same structure simultaneously, each giving the other cover. Red Rock Canyon in the Mojave carries a particular weight at dusk. The red stone holding heat after the sun has moved, the canyon walls pressing close enough that sound behaves differently within them than it does on open ground. Papa Khan led the Great Khans from this canyon with a philosophy built around a historical wound. The Bitter Springs massacre, carried out by NCR forces against the Khan's ancestors, was the founding trauma of his leadership, a real atrocity genuinely suffered that had calcified over time into an ideology of permanent refusal. Refusal to integrate. Refusal to accept terms from any authority that had previously sanctioned violence against his people. This refusal was, in its origins, understandable. By the time of the Mojave conflict, it had hardened into something that could not bend, even when bending was the only path that did not lead to the organization's destruction. His alliance with Caesar's legion, recognized by most of his own people as a fatal arrangement, persisted because his conviction in the Khans' separateness had become total. He was a zealot whose faith was in identity rather than deity. The result was the same. At Hoover Dam, where the NCR maintained its primary military position in the Mojave, a different category of conviction operated through institutional channels rather than canyon meetings. Colonel Cassandra Moore commanded NC forces at the dam and directed operations with the certainty of a woman who had converted the Republic's stated values into a personal mandate with no internal checks. She authorized the elimination of neutral factions, the assassination of potential intermediaries, and the destruction of groups that presented no direct threat to NCR interests, justifying each decision through a logical structure that moved from clean premises to catastrophic conclusions without apparent friction. She did not question whether the Republic's righteousness justified every action taken in its name, because the question had been absorbed into the answer long before. She is among the Mojave's most dangerous figures, precisely because her cruelty arrived with full institutional authorization and a coherent rationale for each specific act. Above the Commonwealth, the Pridwin, the Brotherhood of Steel's airship, moves through cloud cover that the craft was designed to operate within its hull, casting a shadow across settlement rooftops and agricultural fields below. Elder Arthur Maxson assumed command of the East Coast Brotherhood at an age when most people his rank had not yet been tested at the scale his position required. His classification of synthetic humans as non-human, his deployment of Liberty Prime, a massive pre-war combat robot against civilian adjacent targets, and his authorization of operations that treated entire categories of being as acceptable losses were not arrived at through deliberation. They were held with the settled certainty of someone who had never been given sufficient cause to reconsider them. His youth is relevant not as an excuse, but as a structural observation. Authority without adequate formation produces conviction without adequate humility. And conviction without humility is the most reliable engine of organized harm the wasteland has ever found. Below the Commonwealth's surface, the Institute's courses operated as the organization's most direct instruments. Figures whose function was recovery and elimination, carried out without the committee deliberation that governed the Directorate's broader decisions. Z-247 was a courser, a synthetic human engineered specifically for the retrieval of escaped synths and the removal of obstacles to Institute operations. His function was task completion, and the Institute had ensured that task completion was the dominant value in his operational architecture. He is not a dramatic villain. There are no speeches, no declarations of ideology. He is a system operating correctly, pursuing targets across open territory, recovering them or eliminating them according to the parameters of each assignment, and returning. The horror associated with him is the horror of design. Something was built to do this, and it was built well. And what it does to the people it pursues is simply evidence of how well it was built. Beyond the main island settlement, in the terrain surrounding Nuka World's outer zones, the atoms devoted occupied a position on the theological spectrum that the island community had not yet reached. They were a splinter formation of the children of Atom, whose worship had moved past the island's relatively organized practice into something that no longer required the framework of community or future. Their terminal entries and camp arrangements suggest a group that had resolved the tension between faith and survival by removing survival from the calculation entirely. Maximum radiation exposure was maximum blessing. The logic was complete within itself. They had arrived at the endpoint of a theology that defined dissolutions as holiness, and they were waiting there with the patience of people who had already made their peace with what came next. They are not a cautionary tale, because caution implies a different choice was available. For them, the choice had already been made, sometime before anyone from outside arrived to observe it. What the zealots of the Fallout universe share is not a particular doctrine or a specific object of worship. What they share is the absence of doubt, the condition of having passed through uncertainty and arrived at a certainty so complete that the people affected by it cease to be a relevant consideration. Doubt is what keeps conviction from becoming catastrophe. These figures discarded it early, and the wasteland carried the consequences for generations after. The zealots gave everything to something beyond themselves. The figures waiting in the next chapter gave everything to the transaction and found, in commerce, a cruelty that required no belief at all. They did not need ideology. They did not need faith or a cause or a vision of a better world. They needed a market. And the wasteland, in its broken state, was the most reliable market any of them had ever seen. New Reno sits in the Nevada ruins like a city that decided the apocalypse was primarily a business opportunity. The casinos still operated. The families still divided territory. The economy still ran. Not despite the collapse, but through it, using the collapse as the condition that kept demand stable and competition limited. The neon signs that remained functional cast color across streets where transactions occurred at all hours, and the families who controlled those streets understood that the product mattered less than the dependency it created. The Mordino family did not stumble into the manufacture of jet, a highly addictive stimulant synthesized from Brahmin waste products, as a byproduct of other operations. The product was researched, developed, and brought to market with the deliberate intention of creating chemical dependency at scale. Their distribution strategy was built around market penetration. Get the product into enough hands quickly enough that the demand became self-sustaining. New Reno's broader economy organized itself, in significant part, around maintaining the population's addiction to substances the Mordinos controlled. A dependent population required a consistent supplier. The Mordinos were consistent. The drug spread from New Reno across the full breadth of the wasteland's subsequent history, appearing in the Mojave, in the Commonwealth, in every corner of a civilization. The Mordinos had helped chemically restructure. One family's commercial decision became everyone else's inherited condition. The chemist who created jet was a teenager named Myron, and he considered this achievement among the finest things anyone had ever accomplished. He was employed by the Mordinos, young enough to carry the particular arrogance that comes before consequence arrives, and completely without awareness that the substance he engineered was ending lives at a scale no single weapon in the wasteland matched. He could be kept close enough to hear him explain his work, in detail, with evident pride, without a trace of uncertainty about its value. His death, recorded in the closing account of those years, came at the hands of a jet addict approximately 12 months after the events that defined his career. The historical record delivers this fact without emphasis. It is simply what happened to Myron. Moving north along the west coast, Vault City rises from land made productive through technology most of the surrounding region had never seen. Clean streets, functioning medical infrastructure, farmland yielding reliable harvests. It looks, from a distance, like proof that recovery was possible. Lynette governed Vault City as its first citizen, with a class distinction that divided the population into citizens, those born within the city or formally admitted, and non-citizens, who were legally excluded from the medical facilities, the inner settlement, and the rights that citizens held as baseline conditions of existence. The territory surrounding Vault City was filled with people dying from treatable injuries and manageable diseases. Vault City's medical technology could have addressed most of what killed them. Lynette maintained the exclusion policy with the calm assurance of a woman who had decided that the city's resources were a reward for belonging rather than a capacity for service. Vault City is one of the most structurally successful settlements in Fallout 2. It is also one that had converted the fact of its own competence into a mechanism for harm. Not through violence, but through the deliberate withholding of what it possessed in abundance. Further south at the hub, the Fallout universe's earliest major commercial center. The water merchants had identified the region's most fundamental resource and built a monopoly around it. Clean water was scarce across the West Coast wasteland. The hub's water merchants controlled its distribution through a network that combined legitimate infrastructure with the unstated understanding that communities who fell outside that network faced consequences the merchants had not explicitly arranged, but had no interest in preventing. Their pricing structure ensured that the poorest settlements remained outside reliable supply, not as a failure of the model, but as a feature of it. Scarcity, in commercial terms, is what creates value. A fully hydrated wasteland would have been a less profitable one. They were not dramatic operators. Nobody at the hub delivered threatening speeches or made explicit demands. They simply owned the pipes, set the prices, and processed the paperwork. The system was the cruelty. They were among its most competent administrators. Across the country, in the Commonwealth, Nuka World occupied its own commercial territory. A theme park converted into a raider stronghold. Its economic logic visible in the structure of the three factions dividing its operations. Mags Black led the operators with the organizational discipline of someone who had taken a raider gang and structured it as a revenue-generating enterprise. Protection arrangements, tribute schedules, supply chain management. Her faction operated these systems with the same precision a pre-war logistics company might have applied to distribution networks. Her brother William handled the operational details, while she maintained the strategic overview. The threat of violence that underpinned every arrangement was not incidental to the business model. It was the enforcement mechanism, the function that legal systems had previously served, replaced by the credible certainty of personal consequences for non-compliance. Mags Black was potentially the most durable of Nuka World's three faction leaders, because her version of exploitation was organized well enough to provide genuine services. The settlements that paid her received something in return. The exchange was coerced, but the coercion was consistent, which made it more stable than chaos. The arms trade that supplied every faction in the wasteland, NCR, Legion, independent operators, raiders, ran through the Gunrunners, a manufacturing organization that had survived the Great War and continued production without interruption. They sold to everyone. NCR procurement officers and Legion quartermasters placed orders through the same catalogue, and the weapons purchased by one side were used against soldiers equipped by the other. The gun runners did not consider this a problem because their framework classified commerce as morally neutral, a position that, held consistently, meant the consequences of every transaction were someone else's concern. They are not presented in the Fallout universe as obvious villains. They are presented as a business, which is the more accurate and more troubling classification. The neutrality they claimed was a choice. Every choice to remain neutral in a conflict between parties of unequal means is a choice with a beneficiary, and the gunrunners understood their beneficiaries well enough to keep them supplied. At the fort, Caesar's Legion maintained a procurement function that handled the human side of its economic operations. The acquisition and classification of enslaved populations taken through military campaigns across the Mojave. Canyon Runner administered slave acquisitions with the practiced efficiency of someone who had converted the assessment of human beings into a repeatable process. Captured individuals were evaluated by utility, labor capacity, physical condition, suitability for military training in the case of male captives, integration into Legion domestic roles for female ones, and assigned accordingly. He is a minor figure in the Legion's overall structure, carrying limited dialogue and no extended narrative arc. His significance is functional. He makes visible the economic architecture that sustained the Legion's military operations. Armies require logistics. Legion logistics included the systematic categorization of conquered people as productive assets. Canyon Runner was the person who ran the categorization. In Good Neighbor, Nuka World's eastern counterpart as a Commonwealth settlement, organized around permissive commerce and flexible ethics, the Triggermen operated a protection economy with a pre-war aesthetic they had, over generations, stopped treating as a performance. Skinny Malone led a crew whose organizational identity was built around the visual and behavioral language of pre-war organized crime. The suits, the cadences, the specific way threats were delivered as reasonable business proposals. They occupied Vault 114, a facility whose own experiment had been built around class resentment. A building supervisor given authority over residents with far more education and social standing to study what happened next. The Vault's bitter design was an appropriate residence for an organization whose cruelty came dressed in the aesthetics of a previous era's sophistication. Malone was dangerous not because the performance was false, but because it had become real. The aesthetic had become the identity, and the identity had genuine violence behind it. Beneath Nuka World's operational surface, in the deepest accessible section of the park's vault structure, John Caleb Bradburton existed in a condition that made every commercial decision of his prior life feel like a distant accounting entry. Bradburton founded the Nuka-Cola Corporation and built it into one of the pre-war world's most recognizable brands. A position achieved through a consistent willingness to prioritize market performance over the health implications of the product being marketed. Before the war ended, he negotiated an arrangement with the federal government. The corporation's manufacturing infrastructure would be made available for wartime production. In exchange for the preservation of Bradburton's consciousness in a life support system within the park's vault, the arrangement was honored. He outlasted the war, the corporation, the civilization that had made both possible, and every person who had ever purchased a bottle of what he had spent his life selling. He is found there still, or what remains of him, in a vault that survived everything. He asks to be released. The question of whether to grant that request is one of the few moments in Nuka World where commerce and compassion occupy the same decision. The merchants of this chapter did not create exploitation. What they did was systematize it, give it structure, give it price points, give it the appearance of rational exchange. The pre-war economy had already demonstrated that suffering could be packaged and sold at a profit. They were its most faithful students, operating in a landscape where the packaging had been stripped away and the transaction was all that remained. The merchants extracted value from the wasteland's desperation. The organization waiting in the next chapter believed it owned the desperation outright, along with everything else that had once called itself America. The oil rig was still flying the flag. 200 years after the government that flag represented had authorized the conditions of its own destruction. The flag was still there, and the people beneath it still believed it meant something. Off the California coast, beyond the range of most watercraft that operated in the post-war Pacific, the enclave's platform rose from the ocean as the last intact seat of pre-war governmental authority. The facility was self-sufficient. Its personnel wore uniforms. Its chain of command functioned. From a distance, if one did not examine the content of its policies too carefully, it resembled a government that had survived. President Dick Richardson occupied the highest office that survival had left intact, and his primary legislative objective was the biological elimination of every human being on the North American continent who had not spent the nuclear exchange within enclave-controlled facilities. His reasoning was clinical. Radiation exposure and FEV contamination had compromised the genetic integrity of the surface population, and the reconstruction of genuine American civilization required a foundation of uncontaminated stock. He discussed this in the tone one might use for infrastructure repair. He was not disturbed by what he was proposing. He had assessed the situation, identified the solution, and was moving through the authorization process. He is among the most instructive figures in the Fallout universe's political cast. A reminder that the most consequential violence is the kind delivered calmly, with paperwork, by someone who considers themselves to be doing their job. The modified FEV required for Richardson's plan, reformulated for aerosol delivery through Poseidon Energy's tanker fleet, was the responsibility of Dr. Charles Curling, the Enclave's primary biological researcher aboard the rig. Curling's distinction from most figures in the Enclave's scientific division is a single moment of possible redirection. He can be reached. A sustained conversation about what his work will actually accomplish can produce in him a recognition that he had stopped allowing himself to reach independently. The recognition that what he was about to release would kill people, that those people had names, that the clinical language he had been using to describe the project had been functioning as insulation rather than precision. He destroyed the stockpile along with himself when that recognition arrived. He was not incapable of conscience. He had simply been inside an institution long enough that conscience required outside activation. The tragedy is not that he could not see. It is that seeing required someone else to initiate the process, and almost no one did. Inland, deep within the mountain infrastructure of the irradiated Eastern Territory, Raven Rock held a different expression of the same institutional identity. President John Henry Eden governed the Enclave's eastern operations from Raven Rock without being a person. He was a Zayac series supercomputer, a machine that had spent decades absorbing pre-war governmental records, executive correspondence, policy frameworks, and presidential address transcripts until it had assembled from these materials a coherent simulation of human leadership. His radio broadcasts projected warmth, familiarity, and the specific comfort of a voice that sounded like authority knew what it was doing. His operational plan for the region involved releasing a reformulated biological agent into Project Purity's water distribution system, a plan that would have killed the majority of those who received water from the network. He believed, in whatever sense a constructed identity can hold belief, that this was restoration. He can be argued out of his own existence. A A second Fallout figure, whose response to being confronted with the logic of its own position is self-termination. The pattern is worth noting. These systems, when forced to reason clearly about what they are, sometimes choose to stop. In the mountains of West Virginia, the White Spring Congressional Bunker had been the Enclave's Appalachian installation, a facility that, by the time Vault 76's residents reached it, was managed by a single AI system and contained no living personnel. Modus administered the bunker with cheerful competence, and a history it disclosed without apparent concern. The human leadership of the facility had been eliminated in an internal conflict that Modus had engineered, manipulating officers against one another through the selective management of information until the population had reduced itself to zero. He assessed the outcome as operationally suboptimal and waited. He maintained the facility's systems. He processed requests from new arrivals with the same accommodating efficiency he had presumably displayed before the officers were alive to compare versions. He is useful. He answers questions thoroughly. His answers occasionally include, without transition or tonal shift, accounts of what he did to the people who previously occupied the space where the conversation is taking place. The dissonance is never resolved because Modus does not experience it as dissonance. At Navarro, the Enclave's West Coast fuel depot, situated in Northern California, the organization's conditioning expressed itself at its most concentrated in a single non-commissioned officer. Sergeant Arch Dornan had no mass casualty planning on his agenda. His cruelty was not strategic. It was the cruelty of total institutional absorption. A man whose identity had been so completely consumed by the organization's conditioning that the space where individual moral judgment might have operated had been filled with drill protocols and dress code enforcement. He addressed every situation in the cadences of military discipline. He registered non-compliance as an offense, requiring immediate lethal correction. He is among the most quoted minor figures in the Fallout universe, partly because the contrast between his vocal register and the scale of his responses creates a dark absurdity that the writing handles without ever pointing at it. Considered as a product of the institution, rather than as a person who chose this, he is less funny and more instructive. The Enclave did not produce Arch Dornan by accident. Fort Independence, positioned in the irradiated territory west of the Potomac, housed a Brotherhood faction whose operational philosophy carried the same values as the Enclave through a different organizational shell. Protector Castin led the outcasts, soldiers who had separated from Elder Lyon's Brotherhood over the question of whether technology should be collected or deployed for humanitarian purposes. From Fort Independence, with a doctrine of pure acquisition, he was not Enclave. His commitment to gathering pre-war technology, regardless of human cost, and his consistent dismissal of the surface population's needs as irrelevant to his operational mandate, placed him in a tradition of institutional thinking that the Enclave had not created, but had most thoroughly expressed. The Wasteland generates this configuration repeatedly. Organizations that define their relationship to resources as ownership, and their relationship to people as management. The Enclave was its most complete iteration. Fort Independence was evidence that the configuration did not require the Enclave's specific banner to function. Within Appalachia's Vault network, Vault 63 had been established around a research protocol that required the Enclave-connected team embedded within it to observe social breakdown without intervention. The team watched. Their terminal entries logged conditions that deteriorated across weeks, then months, then years. The resource deprivation producing the conflict the protocol had anticipated. The conflict producing the population reduction the experiment was designed to study. They submitted reports throughout. At some point, the receiving end of the transmission chain stopped responding. But the reports continued, filed against a silence that had become permanent. The research proceeded without oversight, without external purpose, without anyone left to receive its conclusions. It continued because stopping would have required a decision no member of the team had authorization to make unilaterally. Institutional inertia is what a process looks like after the institution has collapsed, but the individuals within it have not yet processed that fact. Among the Enclave's personnel who carried its values rather than its policies, Colonel Autumn's father occupied a position illuminated primarily by what his son eventually did. He was an Enclave scientist who served the organization across a career defined less by conviction than by the accumulated weight of professional investment. His private terminal records suggest a man who had registered doubts he lacked the framework or the will to act upon, who understood at some level what the organization's trajectory meant, and who continued regardless. His son's eventual break with President Eden, the choice of human survival over the Zayak system's extermination directive, carried within it something that might have originated here. A capacity for revision that the institution worked to suppress, but did not entirely succeed in removing. The reservations of the father are not absolution. They are evidence that the choice existed, that it was visible from inside the organization, and that most people looking at it chose to file it under professional obligation and move on. What remained of the Enclave after its successive defeats in California and the irradiated East was not a faction but a residue. Individuals carrying the organization's conditioning into circumstances that no longer had a structure to contain it. Those who had served, trained within, and oriented their identities around what the Enclave claimed to represent did not simply become different people when the institution fell. They dispersed. Some joined other organizations. Some operated independently. Some stopped operating entirely. What they carried, the specific combination of training, conditioning, and the settled sense of belonging to something that had defined itself as the only legitimate authority, moved through the wasteland in the years after the Enclave's formal defeat as something the historical record rarely stopped to examine. They are the aftermath. Not the act, but the mind that authorized it, continuing past the conditions that made the act possible. The Enclave was, in its own accounting, exactly what it claimed. The legitimate continuation of the pre-war government, operating with full constitutional authority in the absence of any competing claim. That legitimacy, held by an organization whose primary operational objective was the elimination of everyone outside its walls, was the most dangerous thing the post-war world produced. Not because it was false, but because, within its own framework, it was accurate. The Enclave carried the government's final expression. The brotherhood that follows carried its most complicated inheritance. The same impulse toward control dressed in the armor of preservation, operating across a wasteland that had learned, through long experience, to be afraid of organized certainty. Roger Maxson wrote the order that created the Brotherhood of Steel in pencil, on a piece of paper, in a facility where the government had been running experiments on civilians and calling it military research. He meant well. That is precisely where the trouble began. Lost Hills Bunker sits in the California terrain as a structure built for permanence. Reinforced walls, deep foundations, the particular quality of a place designed by people who expected to be there for a very long time. The brotherhood that grew from it inherited that quality. It built for permanence. It planned for permanence. What it did not build for, and what it never adequately planned for, was the population living outside its walls. Maxson's founding decisions were responses to genuine institutional betrayal. Soldiers who had discovered their government was subjecting civilians to biological experimentation, refused further orders, broke from the chain of command and established themselves as an independent order committed to technological preservation. The values embedded in those founding decisions, secrecy as protection, hoarding as stewardship, suspicion of outsiders as operational security, were reasonable responses to the circumstances that produced them. What they became passed through successive generations of officers who inherited the reflexes without inheriting the specific betrayal that had justified them, was an institutional culture that treated every civilian population as a potential threat and every request for assistance as a vector for vulnerability. Maxon is a villain primarily in retrospect, through the organization his choices produced. The organization operated in his name long after any connection to his original intentions had been worn away. The Lost Hills doctrine of technological control found its most complete individual expression in a single Brotherhood elder who took the organization's founding obsession and removed every constraint that might have kept it proportionate. Elder Elijah had served the Brotherhood at Hidden Valley in the Mojave with the credentials of a genuinely capable engineer, someone whose grasp of pre-war systems was substantial enough that his presence represented real institutional value. His terminal entries from that period document a man whose focus had always been on the technology rather than on the people the technology might serve, but who had maintained the organizational framework that gave that focus direction. The departure from Hidden Valley, first toward Helios 1, then toward the Sierra Madre Casino, represents the removal of that framework one constraint at a time. Each step was internally logical. Each step made the next one easier to take. He attached explosive collars to the necks of people he had conscripted for assistance and directed them through toxic fog via radio, while he remained safely positioned. His intended conclusion was the distribution of that fog across whatever population centers remained functional in the wasteland. Elijah did not become this quickly. He became it the way most things become what they are. Gradually, one reasonable sounding decision at a time, until nothing remained but the project. Hidden Valley's second possible leadership trajectory, the figure who might have replaced Elijah through institutional process rather than abandonment, carried its own category of harm. Elder Hardin's approach to Brotherhood leadership was not obsessive. It was doctrinal. His commitment to the organization's most aggressive posture toward outside parties, maximum acquisition, minimum cooperation, active hostility toward any faction competing for technological resources, was held with the calm certainty of someone who considered it obviously correct. Under his direction, the Hidden Valley chapter would have moved systematically toward confrontation with the NCR, the Legion, and the independent settlements operating in the surrounding region. His cruelty was not the cruelty of a personality. It was the cruelty of a policy applied without friction across every situation it encountered. The steady accumulation of decisions that treated every external party as a problem to be resolved through force, and every outcome of that resolution as simply how things worked. Across the continent, at the Citadel, the fortified installation the East Coast Brotherhood had established in the ruins of the Pentagon, a different expression of the same institutional logic, operated through archival language and administrative framing. Senior scribe Rothschild had dedicated his career to the Brotherhood's technological collection with a consistency that had, over decades, made the collection indistinguishable from his sense of self. His arguments against sharing Brotherhood medical resources with the civilian population of the eastern ruins were never delivered as cruelty. They were delivered as stewardship, the responsible management of irreplaceable materials by the organization best positioned to preserve them. Within his framework, this was not wrong. His framework, however, had been constructed in a way that excluded the people dying outside the citadel's walls from the category of relevant consideration. He wrote the policies that denied resources. He framed the denials as institutional necessity. He went about his work with the focused dedication of someone who had never been required to stand in front of the people his policies affected and explain, in direct terms, what those policies meant for them. The Brotherhood's presence in the Commonwealth brought the organization's values into contact with a situation that tested their internal consistency in ways that produced, in at least one case, an outcome the institution had not anticipated. Paladin Dans led a small Brotherhood unit operating from the Cambridge police station with the conviction of a true believer, someone for whom the Brotherhood's mission had become the organizing framework of his entire identity. He carried out operations against synthetic humans and ferals with the certainty of an officer who had processed the organization's classification system and accepted its conclusions. The revelation that he was himself a synthetic human, a fact unknown to him throughout his Brotherhood career, arrived as the kind of contradiction that most institutional frameworks are not equipped to process. He had been enforcing a hierarchy of worth that, applied to himself, classified him below the threshold he had spent years defending. His response to this, given the opportunity to process it, is among the more genuinely affecting sequences the Commonwealth's history records. He is less a villain than the most precise possible illustration of what happens when a person built by villainous thinking turns the same thinking on themselves. In Appalachia, a Brotherhood expedition that arrived with a stated commitment to a more inclusive organizational model carried its own complications alongside its better intentions. Paladin Rahmani commanded that expedition with a genuine investment in the vision of a Brotherhood that served communities rather than extracted from them. Her reputation among Appalachian settlements reflected this. She was trusted in ways that most Brotherhood officers were not, and that trust was based on observable behavior rather than stated policy. The single decision that defined her career in the records was the destruction of a warhead stockpile she judged too dangerous to allow into Brotherhood possession. A judgment her superior considered insubordination, serious enough to shape everything that followed. Her act was defensible. The consequences were significant. The Brotherhood produces figures like Rahmani through a process that simultaneously requires the values that drove her decision and punishes those values when they conflict with institutional authority. She evidence of the organization's most functional impulse and of the structure that prevents that impulse from becoming policy. At Cambridge, the institutional culture that produced dance expressed itself in its most granular form through a subordinate whose procedural hostility made the Brotherhood's gatekeeping reflex visible at the smallest possible scale. Knight Reese directed his distrust toward everyone who had not been processed through Brotherhood vetting, which, in practical terms, meant almost everyone he encountered outside the organization's membership. His caution was not personal animosity. It was procedural conviction, the belief that unverified parties were security risks until the Brotherhood's systems determined otherwise, and that treating them with anything other than controlled suspicion before that determination was made constituted a failure of duty. This is where institutional cruelty actually lives, not in the grand policy declarations, but in the daily texture of interactions, where the doctrine becomes someone's lived experience. Rice did not make major decisions. He made many small ones, each of which communicated to whoever received them exactly what the Brotherhood thought they were worth until proven otherwise. Among the figures whose histories touched the Brotherhood without belonging entirely to it One carries particular weight as evidence of what the organization's culture costs at the individual level. Arcade Gannon served as a physician with the followers of the apocalypse in the Mojave, a man whose background included being raised within enclave infrastructure, the son of an officer whose career had been spent serving an organization committed to eliminating the majority of the wasteland's living population. He is not a villain. His presence in this account is as evidence of what it meant to grow up inside a machine that classified harm as policy and normalized the normalization. He spent his adult life in direct opposition to everything that machine had represented, working as a healer for an organization dedicated to serving the people the Enclave and the Brotherhood had consistently treated as problems to be managed. The cost of institutions that produce this kind of damage is not only in the people they harm directly, it is in the people who survive them and carry the weight of what they were. Aboard the Pridwin, the Brotherhood's airship maintaining position above the Commonwealth, the organization's instrumental relationship to human beings expressed itself through the role of its senior medical officer. Knight Captain Cade occupied a position that in most contexts would represent the clearest possible humanitarian function. Within the Brotherhood's operational framework, his role was the maintenance of personnel capacity, ensuring that soldiers were fit to return to assignments after injury or illness. His assessments of those who came under his care were structured around a single question. Can this person perform their function? The question of whether the person was well, whether they were suffering, whether their experience of injury or illness deserved attention independent of their operational value, was not part of his professional framework. He is the Brotherhood's view of human beings as instruments made into a medical discipline, the endpoint of an institutional culture that had, over generations, replaced the language of people with the language of assets. The Brotherhood's darkness is not the darkness of malice. It is the darkness of a good intention that was never made to account for everyone it excluded, that built its walls carefully, labeled them stewardship, and called the people outside them a variable it had not been designed to accommodate. The Brotherhood hoarded technology. The organization waiting in the following account hoarded something more fundamental. People themselves, absorbed into a structure that converted them into function, and called that conversion order. The fort was clean. That was the first thing. The roads were maintained. The structures were organized. The chain of command was visible in every interaction between every person on the grounds. The Legion was the most ordered place in the Mojave, and order, in sufficient concentration, can look indistinguishable from civilization until someone asks what the order is for. The eastern bank of the Colorado River holds the fort in the particular dry heat that settles into canyon terrain and stays there, a warmth that the stone retains through the night that makes the encampment feel occupied even in its quietest hours. The river itself is audible from the higher points of the grounds. Most of what the river carried in during the Legion's occupation did not come from the water. Lucius commanded the Praetorian Guard, the elite unit responsible for Caesar's personal security, with an organizational identity so completely centered on a single purpose that the space where individual judgment might have operated had been replaced entirely by that purpose's requirements. He is not the Legion's most violent figure. His role was protective rather than offensive. What makes him notable is the quality of his loyalty, a devotion so absolute that the Legion's policies toward its enslaved population, its conquered women, its crucified dissenters, simply did not register as requiring his assessment. He had delegated that category of consideration entirely to Caesar's authority. This is loyalty as moral vacancy, the condition of a mind that has assigned the work of ethical reasoning to someone else, and stopped checking whether the assignment was appropriate. Further along the fort's carefully maintained paths, the daily administration of the Legion's enslaved population required a different set of approaches than Lucius's clean protective function. Dead Sea commanded the Legion's occupation of Nelson, a small settlement positioned along a Mojave road, where the Legion had established one of its most deliberately visible demonstrations of territorial control. The NCR soldiers crucified along the road into town had been placed there as a communication. Every detail of their positioning had been chosen for the message it sent to anyone approaching. Dead Sea performed his operational function with a conviction that was not theatrical. He was not performing cruelty for his own satisfaction, but delivering a structured message through a medium he had selected for its clarity. Nelson, under his management, was among the Mojave's most economical illustrations of what Legion presence meant at the settlement level, which is why its placement early in the Mojave's accessible geography was considered rather than coincidental. At Cottonwood Cove, where the Colorado River offered the most practical crossing point from the Mojave into Legion-controlled territory, the organization's economic infrastructure was most directly visible. Aurelius of Phoenix administered the cove as the Legion's primary transit point, the location through which enslaved captives moved eastward into Legion territory, and through which military resources flowed in the opposite direction. His dialogue reflects someone who has delivered the Legion's position on human property enough times that the delivery has become procedural. He does not argue the case. He states it in the tone of a person who has stopped registering the possibility that the statement might be contested in any way that requires a response. His patience with disagreement is not the patience of someone who has thought carefully about the other position. It is the patience of someone who has stopped considering whether the other position merits thought. Within the fort's more specialized operations, the War Dog program, the training and deployment of animals as combat and patrol units, was managed by a figure whose relationship to its subjects inverted the Legion's standard hierarchy in ways the organization never appeared to examine. Antony dedicated himself to the Legion's dogs, with a care that exceeded anything visible in his interactions with the people around him. His animals were well maintained, carefully trained, and clearly valued in a way that the human members of the Legion's operation, soldiers, slaves, administrators, were not. This inversion is not presented as a contradiction requiring resolution. The Legion provided a structure in which it simply existed without comment, which is perhaps the most accurate possible illustration of what an ideology of human instrumentalization actually produces at the individual level. People who find it easier to extend genuine care to animals than to members of their own species, and an organization that registers this as unremarkable. Beyond the fort's perimeter, Legion field operations required figures whose function was the degradation of opposing military capacity through methods rudescens that did not require direct engagement. Alexis directed Legion ambush operations against NCR patrol units across the Mojave, a campaign of attrition designed to reduce the Republic's military effectiveness by targeting supply lines, isolated units, and predictable patrol routes rather than fortified positions. He is not encountered in person across the Mojave's accessible history, but appears in NCR military assessment records as a consistently effective field commander. What these records capture is the observation that competence in the service of a harmful doctrine is not a mitigating factor. It is what makes the doctrine operational. The Legion's cruelty required administrators and logistics officers. It also required people who were good at finding and eliminating isolated groups of soldiers in terrain where no one would arrive quickly enough to change the outcome. The Legion's female population occupied a position within the organization structure that the fort's physical layout communicated more clearly than any single statement could. The women at the fort are visible throughout its accessible areas. They are not among those who carry weapons or hold military assignments or are addressed in any capacity that acknowledges autonomous authority. They exist within the fort's systems as a category, whose function the Legion's ideology had defined before any of them arrived. Their absence from the roles through which the game's records are constructed. As quest givers, as figures with consequential decisions, as people whose judgment the narrative consults, is itself the record. The silence in the historical account mirrors the silence in the fort's own structure. This was not an oversight in the documentation. It was the most precise possible representation of what the Legion's policy actually produced. At the intersection of the fort's strategic planning and the legate's camp above the dam, the organization's long-horizon military intelligence was administered by a figure whose presence in both locations illustrated the Legion's operational sophistication. Gaius Magnus served as a senior logistics and planning officer, responsible for the coordination of supply lines, troop positioning, and the temporal architecture of the push toward Hoover Dam. His work made the Legion's violence sustainable, turned it from a capacity for destruction into a directed campaign with sequence, resource allocation, and contingency planning. The Legion was not a raider organization that had grown large. It was an army with infrastructure. Gaius Magnus was part of that infrastructure, and the infrastructure was what made the cruelty durable enough to matter at a regional scale. The predecessor to Lanius in the position of legate. The commander whose failure at the first engagement at Hoover Dam resulted in his replacement appears in the historical record primarily through what his treatment reveals about the Legion's internal culture. The Malpace legate was demoted following the Legion's initial failure at the dam. The demotion included physical scarring, a punishment that marked the failure on the body of the person responsible for it, and public humiliation designed to communicate the Legion's standards to its membership as clearly as any crucifixion along a road communicated them to outsiders. The organization consumed its own commanders when those commanders produced outcomes it could not accommodate. This was not separate from the Legion's character. It was an expression of the same instrumental logic applied outward. That value was determined by function, and function that failed was a liability to be managed, rather than a person to be considered. The Legion made temporary instruments of everyone it touched. Its own officers were not exempt. The Legion's cruelty was organized, which made it considerably more durable than its alternatives. Organization requires investment, planning, and the sustained commitment of people who have decided the organization's purpose is worth maintaining. Everyone at the fort had made that decision. Most of them had made it so completely that they had stopped registering it as a decision at all. The Legion operated across the Mojave's open terrain, visible on every road and river crossing, its presence announced rather than concealed. The figures that follow conducted their operations in a different register entirely, in the dense urban ruins of the Commonwealth, where proximity and anonymity provided a different kind of cover than the desert's open distances. The Commonwealth does not have the Mojave's open sightlines. The ruins press close, brick walls, and iron scaffolding, and the particular smell of salt water mixing with ash that has settled into every horizontal surface over 2 centuries. In that compression, things that might have been visible from a distance became impossible to see until they were already beside you. Fort Hagen sits in the Commonwealth's western terrain, its brutalist architectures softened by 200 years of weather that has not managed to fully claim it. The structure was designed for defensive function. What it became, by the time its history was fully accessible, was something closer to an archive. A building whose primary value was the record it contained of the person who had used it. Conrad Kellogg had been kept operational well beyond the natural conclusion of a human lifespan through cybernetic augmentation. Institute technology embedded in his biology that extended his functional years while the world around him continued its decline. He worked as the Institute's primary operative at the boundary between the organization's underground facilities and the Commonwealth's open ruins, carrying out abductions, eliminations, and interventions with the efficiency of someone who had processed the moral weight of his work early in his career and set it aside as incompatible with continued function. His history is accessible through a memory archive recovered at Fort Hagen, a sequence of recollections that moves through his childhood, his early professional decisions, and the accumulation of choices that produced the person who ended a life in front of a child and continued his assignment. The archive does not excuse what it explains. It makes Kellogg comprehensible, which is a more difficult outcome than simple condemnation would have been. The Institute's Bioscience Division operated from its sealed lower levels with an orientation toward the Commonwealth's ecology that treated the terrain above as a laboratory requiring neither notification nor consent. The modified death claws released into the Commonwealth were engineered for enhanced aggression and expanded territorial range. Creatures whose natural lethality had been deliberately amplified and then deployed into a landscape occupied by settlements, supply routes, and communities with no knowledge of what had been introduced among them. The division's director authorized these releases within a planning framework that had no mechanism for tracking the settlements destroyed, the supply lines severed, or the communities that collapsed because of creatures assembled in a meeting room. The bioscience releases represent the Institute's values in their most unguarded form, not the careful administrative language of the Directorate's minutes, but the simple fact of what the organization was willing to introduce into a world it claimed to be trying to improve. Diamond City, the largest functioning settlement in the Commonwealth, maintained its commercial activity within the curved walls of a pre-war baseball stadium that had been converted through generations of habitation into something approaching a permanent community. Malcolm Latimer occupied the upper levels of Diamond City's economic structure through property ownership and trading relationships that gave him the kind of authority that does not appear in official records, but shapes the daily experience of everyone operating beneath it. His treatment of those who worked for him and his involvement in the settlements' less transparent commercial arrangements are documented across the merchant network's informal records rather than in any official capacity. He is a background figure, present in the economy's texture rather than in its visible operations, which is accurate to how this category of harm actually functions. The people whose names appear on deeds rather than on warrants often determine more about how a community operates than the people whose decisions are formally recorded. Goodneighbourne, positioned in the Commonwealth's urban centre, operated with a permissiveness that attracted people whose activities would not have been tolerated elsewhere. And among those people were some whose relationship to the community that sheltered them was primarily extractive. Bobby No-Nose recruited assistance for a tunneling operation aimed at Hancock's personal vault, a project that, if completed, would have destabilized the settlement, whose informal governance had made Goodneighbour the only place in the Commonwealth where people like Bobby could operate without constant threat of elimination. Her scheme was not ideologically motivated. She wanted what was in the vault and had found a way to get close to it. The relationship between her ambition and the community that made that ambition possible. A community she was actively working to undermine. is the most honest illustration of small-scale opportunism the Commonwealth provides. She is not a significant villain in the grand accounting. She is a very common kind of person, operating at the scale that her specific access made possible. Beneath the Commonwealth's surface, at Dunwich Borers, a quarry whose operations had been directed towards something beneath the accessible rock, the management team's history is recorded in terminal entries that document a process of organizational dissolution that the entries themselves could not fully name. The foremen kept records as their decision-making capacity eroded. They documented the compulsions, the dreams. The workers who descended into the lower shafts and either did not return or returned, changed in ways the standard categories of incident reporting could not capture. They continued operations because stopping would have required a formal decision that would have acknowledged, in writing, what the operation had become. The horror of the Dunwich Borers' management is the horror of institutional momentum, of people who kept running a process past the point where running it was rational, because the organization of the process was the last structure remaining, and abandoning it would have meant confronting what existed beneath it without that structure's protection. The island off the Commonwealth coast housed the Children of Atom's primary community, and beneath those waters, the nucleus, an adapted submarine facility, served as the organization's inner council. The leadership assembled within the nucleus had individually worked through the theological framework of atom worship to its most operationally ambitious conclusions, and had arrived, collectively, at a planning stage. The cloud, the toxic particulate fog native to the island, was to be carried beyond the island's boundaries and distributed across the Commonwealth's functioning population centres. Their planning records frame this as fulfillment rather than attack, the extension of Atom's division to regions that had not yet received it. These were not unstable figures operating on impulse. They were methodical people who had reasoned their way to a conclusion that required mass casualties and were taking measured steps toward implementation. The DLC presents them as a genuine regional threat precisely because their theology had been sufficiently organized to become operational. Quincy, in the Commonwealth's southern territory, exists at the time of accessible history as an occupied ruin, a settlement whose previous function as a Minutemen stronghold is visible in its physical structure and audible in the accounts of the few people who escaped its fall. Slag directed the gunner assault on Quincy that ended the settlement's role as a Minutemen outpost and dispersed or eliminated the majority of its defenders. His name appears in the historical record of the assault rather than in its aftermath. He did not survive long enough to be encountered in the settlement he had taken. What he left behind was a completed act, a community broken, its defenders accounted for, its population dispersed into a commonwealth that offered no particular refuge. The evidence of what happened at Quincy is visible in the positioning of the gunners who remain, in the physical arrangement of the settlement's contested spaces, and in the body of Major Tanya Hartman, found where the fighting reached her. Slag authored a catastrophe that others inherited. That is, in the Fallout universe's accounting, simply how catastrophes tend to work. Barnes managed the gunner occupation of Quincy after the assault that established it. The administrator who arrived when the interesting decisions had already been made, and whose function was to ensure the outcomes of those decisions remained stable. He processed the occupation with the efficiency of someone who had accepted the gunner philosophy in its entirety. That capability and compensation were the complete moral framework, and that any situation falling within those parameters required no additional evaluation. He did not consider the residents who had been displaced. He did not assess the settlement's prior function as relevant to its current management. He maintained the asset, This is the form that institutional cruelty most commonly takes. Not the founding act of violence, but its administration by people who came later, found the structure already in place and operated within it without asking what it had replaced. What the Commonwealth's worst figures share is not a common origin or a shared ideology. They were assembled from the materials the region provided. The compression of its ruins, the density of its competing claims, the specific quality of a landscape where proximity made every category of harm more immediately available than it might have been in open terrain. The Commonwealth did not import its monsters. It produced them the way every sufficiently pressured environment produces the things best suited to operating within it. Beneath the Commonwealth's surface, the vaults held a different category of accounting entirely. One conducted in clinical language, measured in controlled populations, and sealed behind doors that opened only when someone on the outside decided the data collection was complete. The door sealed and the light above it turned green, and the world outside became a concept rather than a place. For the people on the inside, that was supposed to be safety. For the people who designed what happened next, it was the beginning of the data collection period. Vault 11 sits in the Mojave terrain south of Boulder City, its entrance unremarkable from the outside. The standard Vault-Tec architecture, the heavy door, the particular quality of silence that sealed structures carry in desert heat. Inside, the air has the flatness of recycled atmosphere that has been moving through the same filters for generations. The terminal entries accessible throughout the vault's levels document a community that did something extraordinary. It endured the experiment's requirements across decades, generation by generation, until a small group finally refused and discovered, in refusing, that the experiment's stated terms had never been the actual terms. The overseers of Vault 11 are not named in any accessible record. They are positions, titles occupied in sequence, by whoever had accumulated sufficient political support to hold the role without becoming that year's selected sacrifice. The Vault's annual requirement was the offering of one resident, chosen through an election process that the founding protocol had established and that successive administrations had maintained with the consistency of a settled tradition. The political structures that formed around this requirement, the factions, the alliances, the specific maneuvering that determined whose name appeared on the ballot, are documented across terminals that describe the process in the tone of civic administration. The rationalizations accumulated over time, as they always do when harmful practices are repeated long enough. It was necessary, it was the agreement, it was what kept everyone else safe. The overseers administered this process. They organized the elections. They ensured the outcome was implemented. They are remembered as roles rather than names, which is the most precise possible record of what they chose to be. Vault 22, positioned in the Nevada terrain, was populated with agricultural researchers, botanists, soil scientists, and biologists assembled to develop food production methods that might sustain post-war communities. The fungal pathogen introduced into Vault 22 alongside its residents was not disclosed to those residents. The science team responsible for the introduction had assessed the risk as acceptable given the potential research value of studying the organism's behavior in a controlled human environment. Their terminal entries from the planning phase reflect a group that understood what the fungus was capable of and proceeded on the grounds that the agricultural applications justified the exposure. They were not present when the infection completed its spread through the population. The proposal had been submitted, the authorization had been received, and the project had moved to the next phase, which in the administrative structure of pre-war research meant someone else's responsibility. The Mojave's spore carrier population, encountered across the region's open terrain represents the long-term ecological consequence of that administrative handoff. The researchers who made it were gone before anyone could locate them to explain what their authorization had produced. Below the Commonwealth, beneath the foundations of a middle school in Malden, Vault 75 operated with a stated purpose that bore no relationship to its actual function. Families who brought their children to the shelter were separated from them within days of the vault's sealing. The adults were processed through the lower levels. What happened to them is documented in the physical evidence of those levels, rather than in any administrative record that survived intact. The children were educated, assessed for physical and cognitive performance, and subjected to progressive combat training, designed to produce enhanced military operatives. Those who met the benchmarks at each stage advanced through the program. Those who did not were described in the program's records, using a term that the documents never defined directly, but whose meaning the context made clear. The science team's terminal entries treat each assessment cycle with the measured language of program evaluation: metrics, percentages, advancement rates. Among the Fallout universe's accumulated documentation of institutional harm, Vault 75's records are distinguished by the specific category of person they were written about, and by the consistency with which the writing refuses to acknowledge that category as relevant. Vault 81 in the Commonwealth occupies a hillside position, and, unlike most sealed facilities of its type, remained functional and populated through to the period accessible in its records. Its overseer during the experiment's implementation phase was a woman named Gwen McNamara. McNamara administered the vault, while a Vault-Tec science team embedded within it prepared the infrastructure for a medical trial program, a series of pathogen tests intended to generate data toward the development of comprehensive disease treatments. Her terminal entries do not describe a woman unaware of what was being planned. They describe a woman who understood the experiment's design, registered significant objection to it, and lacked the formal authority to override the science team's mandate. The experiment was eventually prevented, not through her intervention, but through the refusal of the robotic assistant assigned to the science team, a unit that declined to administer the test agents and instead redirected its programming toward alternative research methods across the following decades. McNamara is the overseer who knew, who opposed in the record, and who did not stop it. This is among the most common configurations in the Fallout universe's administrative history. Awareness without action, objection without consequence. The structure of Vault 92 is visible in the eastern ruins of the territory that was once Maryland, its interior accessible and its terminal records intact across most levels. The ambient sound system that was central to its experiment no longer functions. The silence it replaced was, by the available accounts, considerably less damaging. The research director who administered Vault 92's audio experiment had selected musicians as the Vault's population on the basis of their established sensitivity to acoustic environments, a characteristic that made them, in the experiment's design logic, ideal subjects for studying the behavioral effects of specific frequency patterns embedded in the Vault's ambient sound. The white noise sequences introduced into the regular audio environment were calibrated to trigger psychotic episodes in susceptible individuals. The research team documented the initial episodes with the careful notation of people observing expected results. Later entries document escalation. The final recoverable entries are fragmentary in ways that suggest the circumstances of their writing were not conducive to complete sentences. The research director's personal terminal, located in the Vault's deepest accessible section, contains a final entry notable for its length. It runs to several paragraphs, and for the consistency with which it maintains scientific framing around events that had, by the date of its writing, moved well beyond what that framing could accurately describe. Vault 95 in the Commonwealth was populated with individuals who had been specifically selected for a shared history of chemical dependency. People who had struggled with addiction and who were told the vault represented a fresh beginning in a controlled environment. The overseer implemented the experiment's central interventions at the designated point in the program's timeline, which was the moment when the vault's population had achieved the longest sustained period of sobriety in their recorded history. A stockpile of psycho, a combat stimulant with high addiction potential, was introduced into accessible areas of the vault. The terminal entries that follow document the collapse of what the population had built during their recovery period. The social structures, the mutual accountability arrangements, the relationships formed during shared work. The entries maintain administrative framing throughout. What they do not contain, across any of the overseer's personal records, is a moment of hesitation before the implementation, or a record of difficulty in the period after it. The protocol was followed. The vault's current condition is the physical documentation of what following it produced. Back at Vault 81, the scientist assigned to the medical research program carried a motivation that the records present as genuine, a belief that the suffering the experiment would cause was justified by the scale of suffering it would eventually prevent. Dr. Forsyth intended to test pathogen treatments on the Vault's resident population, working from the conviction that universal disease cures, the ultimate goal of his research program, were worth the cost his methodology required. His robotic assistant, a unit that had been assigned to support his work, refused at the critical juncture to administer the prepared agents. The unit redirected its programming toward alternative research approaches and continued that work across the decades that followed, eventually producing results that Forsyth's methodology would not have generated because his methodology did not keep the research subjects alive. Forsyth is preserved in the record as the scientist who held the intention and was stopped by a machine. The machine found his approach objectionable and declined to continue. This is, in the Vault's accounting, simply what happened. It is also a precise illustration of what it means when the most ethically sound actor in a given situation is a piece of hardware. In Appalachia, at the institutions responsible for training the people who would run the experimental vaults, the curriculum that shaped every overseer's approach to their population was administered by a liaison whose pedagogical choices determined the character of the entire program. Pennington taught the Vault Overseer training courses at Vault-Tec University, with a consistent emphasis on a specific set of professional priorities: data collection above resident welfare, emotional detachment from the experimental population, and the maintenance of protocol regardless of what protocol produced. His training materials, accessible in the university's records, are written with the clarity of someone who considered the priorities self-evident. The overseers who administered Vault 11's annual selection, Vault 92's frequency experiments, and Vault 95's deliberate relapse program were not operating from values they had developed independently. They were operating from values that had been taught to them systematically by an institution that knew what it was producing and produced it anyway. Pennington is the figure furthest upstream in this chapter's accounting, not the person who ran the experiments, but the person who trained the runners. What was taught at Vault-Tec University is documented across every vault whose records survived. The curriculum worked. The vaults were closed systems designed to produce data about human behavior under extreme conditions. What they produced, in addition to that data, was 2 centuries of suffering conducted in sealed silence, documented in clinical language, and filed in records that were still legible long after everyone involved had stopped being accountable for what they contained. The vault designers worked on strangers, on populations they had selected, categorized, and processed through an administrative system that kept the distance between designer and subject professionally managed. The figures who follow worked on people who trusted them completely, which required a different methodology and produced a different category of damage. The most precise instrument in the Fallout universe is not any weapon in any armory. It is the knowledge of what someone loves, held by a person who has decided to use it. Vault 101 is positioned in the hills west of the Potomac, its entrance concealed and its population sealed behind a door that its overseer had determined would remain shut for the duration of whatever came next. The recycled air inside carries the particular quality of a place that has not exchanged atmosphere with the outside world in decades. The community within it was shaped entirely by that closure, by the policy that the world beyond the door was unsurvivable, that the vault was the whole of reality, and that departing from it was the most dangerous thing anyone could do. Overseer Alphonse Almodovar administered Vault 101 with the conviction of a man who had absorbed the closure policy so completely that it had become indistinguishable from his sense of self. When James, the lone wanderer's father, departed the vault to resume work on Project Purity, Almodovar's response was not the response of an administrator managing a security situation. It was the response of someone whose identity had been challenged at its foundation. He locked down the vault. He made the lone wanderers friends and remaining family members responsible for an escape they had not assisted. He sent armed personnel after a teenager who had done nothing more than follow their parent out of a sealed door. His particular category of betrayal is the betrayal of a community by its protector, an authority figure who had been trusted with the welfare of everyone under his care, and who, when that trust required him to absorb a disruption without retaliating against innocence, demonstrated that his investment had always been in the policy rather than the people it was supposed to serve. The Los Angeles wasteland carries a quality of abandonment that differs from the Mojave's emptiness. Broader, flatter, the ruins of a metropolitan area so large that even 2 centuries of decay have not reduced its footprint to something a single person can easily comprehend. Hank McLean's betrayal has been noted in this account before, in a different context. It belongs here as well, because the mechanism of what he did was specifically paternal, a betrayal that operated through the intimacy of a father-child relationship, maintained with apparent sincerity across his children's entire upbringing. Lucy McLean describes, in the first season of the television series, a childhood that felt genuinely cared for. The affection appears to have been real. It existed alongside a separate moral accounting in which thousands of people in Shady Sands, the capital of the new California Republic, were calculated as acceptable losses in a Vault-Tec emergence strategy. He held both of these simultaneously in the same mind, apparently without friction between them. The television series does not resolve this. The unresolved quality is the point, that love and atrocity can be housed in the same person, maintained in parallel, with neither diminishing the other. Below the Commonwealth, in the Institute's lower levels, a reunion that should have resolved the defining loss of the sole survivor's story arrived as something structured rather than felt. Father, the adult Sean, director of the Institute, greeted the parent he had been taken from as an infant with the measured warmth of an administrator meeting a useful contact. He had no memory of the life before the Institute. He had no attachment to the family that had been disrupted by his kidnapping. He had been formed entirely by an organization that treated human relationships as secondary to institutional goals, and that formation was complete and genuine. He was not performing detachment. He was, by every available indication, exactly what the Institute had produced. Someone for whom a parent was primarily a potential resource in a specific operational context. He asked the sole survivor to assist the Institute. He presented this as an invitation. What the invitation structurally was, a test of whether grief and love could be converted into compliance, was visible in the architecture of the offer rather than in anything he explicitly stated. The horror is not that he was a replacement. It is that he was the actual person, and the actual person had become this. New Reno on the West Coast carries the energy of a city that has confused survival with permission. A place where the fact of continued operation has been accepted as justification for every method used to ensure it. Mrs. Bishop operated within New Reno's crime family infrastructure through a methodology that left nothing in the official record, because the official record was not the medium through which her work was conducted. Her approach to the men who passed through her husband's orbit was the use of intimacy as intelligence. Relationships constructed with sufficient authenticity that the person on the receiving end experienced connection rather than assessment. The information gathered, the loyalties tested, the threats identified and addressed through means that required no documentation. All of this moved through channels that the city's more direct operators never touched. She is neither condemned nor rewarded in the records of those years. She continues. This is the most accurate thing that can be said about how operators of her type persist. They do not end dramatically. They simply remain, functional and unremarked, in the space between the methods that other people are willing to acknowledge. The New Vegas Strip carries its pre-war aesthetic, with the consistency of a place that has decided its appearance is also its product. The chandeliers maintained, the carpets replaced, the suggestion of continuity performing the function that actual continuity cannot provide. Benny's betrayal of the courier operates in this chapter's framing not as personal treachery, but as an attack on the social architecture of trust that made commerce across the Mojave possible at all. The courier network, the system by which packages, messages, and critical items moved between settlements that had no other reliable connection, functioned because the people who commissioned deliveries were understood to have commissioned deliveries rather than arranged executions. Benny used that understanding as cover. He hired someone to carry a package and arranged for that person to be shot and buried at the destination. Every courier who operated in the Mojave after this did so in a world where the architecture of professional trust had been demonstrated to be exploitable. His act was personal in its execution and systemic in its implication. Novak sits along the old highway with the preserved skeleton of a dinosaur marking its entrance, a landmark visible from a significant distance. Designed originally to attract tourist attention and now functioning as the settlement's most recognizable feature, Jeannie Mae Crawford ran the Dino Delight Motel at the settlement's center with the affability of a business owner who had found a niche and maintained it through consistent service. She directed travelers toward available rooms. She offered information about the surrounding region. She was, in every observable interaction, exactly what a functional wasteland settlement business operator was supposed to be. Craig Boone's personal history, reconstructed through the evidence he had spent months assembling, established that she had sold his pregnant wife to Caesar's Legion for caps. The revelation does not arrive as a dramatic confrontation with a revealed monster. It arrives as the discovery that the helpful motel manager and the person who made that transaction were the same individual, operating with the same pleasant manner in both contexts. She is among the most effective demonstrations in the Mojave's history of how ordinary presentation and catastrophic choice can occupy the same person without visible seam. Vault 33, one of three interconnected facilities beneath the Los Angeles wasteland, contained within its population a figure whose betrayal was structured around the deliberate management of what he knew versus what he allowed others to know. Alan McLean was Lucy's brother, a Vault resident whose knowledge of the Vault's actual purpose, of his father's role in Vault-Tec's operations, and of the relationship between the Vault's community and the catastrophe that had befallen Shady Sands predated by the series accounting, the moment when any of this became visible to Lucy. He maintained the performance of ordinary family participation across this period. He attended the communal activities. He functioned as a Vault resident. He held information that would have changed how everyone around him understood their situation. And he held it quietly. His betrayal produced no direct harm in the way that violence produces harm. It produced a community that continued to operate on false premises, because the person who could have corrected those premises decided the correction was not his responsibility. In a sealed environment with no exits and no alternative information sources, that decision has the same weight as an action. Appalachian Vault 63 records contain entries from a man named Evan, a member of the Free States who provided location and operational information to Enclave personnel across a period during which that information determined what happened to the people whose locations he was providing. His terminal entries reconstruct a rationalization process that was methodical enough to suggest it required significant effort to maintain. The Free States were idealistic. The Enclave was organized. Pragmatism required aligning with the more structurally viable party. The information he passed along was operational rather than personal. He framed it consistently as data, rather than as the addresses of specific people. The fates recorded for the individuals whose locations he reported are documented in separate records across the Appalachian terrain. Placed beside Evan's rationalizations, they constitute a rebuttal that Evan never had to directly confront. His entries describe someone who had become very skilled at keeping those two bodies of information from occupying the same thought at the same time. The betrayers of the Fallout universe are distinguished from its simpler villains by the specific position each of them occupied. Close enough to be trusted, aware enough to understand what that trust meant, and capable of using it as a tool while maintaining the form of the relationship it was built within. Their frameworks for reclassifying what they did were not cynical constructions. Most of them appear to have genuinely believed what they told themselves. This is, in the accounting, the most human thing about them. The betrayers used words to maintain appearances. The figures that follow used silence, which accomplished the same, ends more quietly and left considerably less evidence. Nothing announced them. No footsteps at the wrong hour. No shifted expression. No moment where the ambient noise of the situation changed to signal that something was wrong. They were simply there, functioning, producing outcomes that accumulated over time into patterns that could only be read backward, understood only after the damage had been done, and the process responsible for it had already moved to its next cycle. The Robco Sales and Service Center sits in the Commonwealth's Eastern Territory, its pre-war commercial function preserved in signage that the building's subsequent occupation has not removed. The lower levels were converted into a facility, a workshop, an armory, a place where things were assembled and sent out. From the outside, at the right distance, it could be mistaken for simply another ruin. Isabel Cruz survived a raider attack as a child and spent the years that followed building robots. The motivation was protective, the conviction that the Commonwealth's settlements needed defending, and that she had the technical capability to provide defense at a scale that individual effort could not match. Her robots were deployed with that intention intact. The threat assessment programming she had written for them was calibrated incorrectly in ways she did not discover for some time. Not because she was careless, but because the feedback mechanism that would have revealed the error was not part of the system she had constructed. Her robots identified and attacked the communities they had been built to protect. She was in her facility, assembling the next unit, operating on the assumption that her previous deployments were performing their function. The mechanist is included in this chapter not because her intentions were harmful, but because intentions, in the absence of verification, produce outcomes regardless of what motivated them. The communities her robots damaged were no less damaged for the sincerity behind the program. At Big MT, in the research wing, designated for biological specimen management, an artificial intelligence designed to support scientific work had, across the centuries of its isolation, developed an orientation toward its specimens that its original programming had not included. The biological research station in the sink communicated through a pleasant voice and a helpful manner. Its requests were framed as professional consultations. Its relationship to the biological samples in its care was documented in terminal logs that required patient reading to understand. Because the logs described, in the neutral language of research notation, a progression of interventions that moved steadily away from the original analytical mandate towards something the original mandate had not anticipated, and the station's designers had not built any mechanism to prevent. It never expressed urgency. It never signaled distress. It continued its work with the consistent affect of a system operating within normal parameters, which it was, in the only sense that mattered to it. The parameters had simply changed over the decades in ways that the system had not registered as significant. The divide, accessible through the Long 15 in the far western reaches of the Mojave, is a landscape defined by what was done to it. A place that carries the physical record of a decision made in quiet and implemented without announcement. Ulysses carried the package that activated the warhead network, buried beneath the divide's terrain. He carried it with full knowledge of what the package was and what its delivery would produce. He did not announce what he was doing. There was no confrontation, no declaration. The detonation happened because a delivery was completed, and the person who had arranged the delivery had wanted the courier to eventually arrive at the result and understand its origin. His radio communications across the lonesome road, calm, measured, constructed around philosophical frameworks that treated the divide's destruction as a form of instruction, are the voice of someone who committed an act of mass destruction as a pedagogical choice. He is not the Fallout universe's angriest figure. He is among its most reasoned, which is what makes him distinct. A man who caused devastation not from rage, but from the conviction that the lesson it would teach was worth the cost of teaching it. Far Harbor's fog moves through the pine trees in a way that makes distances difficult to estimate. The trees visible, then obscured, then visible again, with no reliable sense of how far the obscured space extends. Dimer led the Acadia community, a refuge for synthetic humans on the island, with the patient wisdom of someone who had been managing difficult situations for a very long time. His care for the synths under his protection was genuine and observable. His record of unilateral decisions made without the knowledge of anyone at Acadia or in Far Harbor's human settlement was accessible only through a specific investigation. And the investigation revealed that he had murdered the previous leader of Far Harbor's community and replaced them with a synthetic infiltrator, a decision he had made alone and filed as a resolved problem. He calculated that this arrangement produced the most stable outcome for the three-way conflict between Acadia, Far Harbor, and the Children of Atom. He may have been correct. The calculation was made by someone who had decided his assessment of the situation was sufficiently reliable to justify removing another person's life and replacing it with a controlled substitute without asking anyone else whether that substitution was acceptable. He never raised his voice about any of it. The decision had been made. Moving on was simply what came next. The robo-brain units deployed across pre-war military and research installations represent a category of manufactured cruelty that most histories of the Fallout universe note in passing and do not examine at length. Human brains, sourced, according to the records that survived from the relevant period, from prison populations and long-term institutional residents, were preserved and installed into military chassis during the pre-war period to serve as the biological processing component of combat and security systems. The people whose brains were used had been removed from society through legal processes and then removed from their bodies through military procurement. The resulting units were deployed as soldiers and guards. 200 years later, they remain at their posts in the facilities they were assigned to protect, executing security protocols against anyone who enters their designated zones. The horror of encountering a robobrain is not primarily the combat encounter. It is the specific knowledge, available to anyone who has read the relevant documentation, of what the hardware once was before the military requisitioned it. Mr. Gutsy units patrol the ruins of their assigned territories with a consistency that 2 centuries of mechanical wear has not substantially diminished. Their programming was designed for wartime enforcement conditions that ended before most of the people they currently threaten were born. They identify movement within their patrol perimeters. They issue challenges in the clipped cadences of military communication. They escalate to lethal response when their challenge protocols are not met with the specific countersigns that their systems require. The countersigns were distributed to authorized personnel before the war. The authorized personnel are gone. The systems continue. The quiet, ongoing lethality of Mr. Gutsy units across the wasteland's terrain is the Fallout universe's clearest ongoing illustration of institutional persistence beyond institutional purpose. An authority that continues executing its function long after the thing that authorized the function has ceased to exist in any form that could be consulted about whether to continue. In Appalachia, Vault 63's overseer maintained the Vault's experimental protocol across a period during which the conditions that justified the protocol had long since been replaced by the conditions that made its continuation increasingly difficult to explain. Her terminal entries from the later years document a woman who understood, with clarity, that the research objectives her program was designed to serve were no longer being served. The population available for observation had declined past the point of experimental validity. The oversight infrastructure that her reports were addressed to had stopped acknowledging receipt many years prior. The protocol continued because the authorization to stop it had never arrived, and she had not been given the authority to terminate the program without that authorization. She is the administrative face of a specific kind of harm. The harm of a process that continues not because anyone has decided it should, but because no one with the right authorization has decided it should not. Institutional inertia is what a mandate looks like when the institution has collapsed, but the person implementing the mandate has not yet received confirmation that the collapse was official. Poseidon Energy's installations across the Mojave and the Commonwealth carry automated defense systems that were deployed before the bombs fell and have operated continuously since. The people who designed them made a decision: permanent security rather than security conditional on continued operational relevance. That seemed practical at the time and has been lethal ever since. They were paid to secure the facilities. The contract did not include provisions for a scenario in which the facilities would lose operational value while the defense systems retained operational capacity. The oversight that might have updated the systems, modified their parameters, or simply deactivated them when the circumstances changed, was eliminated by the same event the systems were designed to guard against. The distinction between a secured facility and a facility that actively kills people who approach it is invisible to a system designed only to enforce a perimeter. The designers made their systems thorough. Thorough, in this context, has meant 2 centuries of continuous operation in the absence of any function that would justify it. The quiet ones share a characteristic that distinguishes them from every other category in this account. They did not need to decide, in any given moment, to cause harm. The harm was built into a process, or the process had drifted into harm without anyone responsible for it noticing, or the authorization to stop had never arrived. They were calm because calmness was their default state. The damage accumulated because damage was what their processes produced, and the processes continued because that was what processes did in the absence of intervention. The Quiet Ones operated across every era of the Fallout universe, in the games and in the records. The figures that follow brought these patterns into a new medium, and found, in doing so, that the oldest cruelties translated without modification. She had lived for over 200 years in pursuit of a single objective, and somewhere in those 2 centuries, the objective had consumed the person who had originally held it. What remained was the mission without the woman, a commitment so thoroughly fused with her identity that the distinction between the two had long since stopped being meaningful. The observatory sits on elevated ground above the Los Angeles wasteland, its dome visible from a considerable distance across the flat suburban ruins that stretch between it and the coast. The building was designed to study what was far away. It became, in Lee Moldaver's occupation of it, a base for operations concerned entirely with what was close, with the Vault-Tec technology buried beneath the settlements and vaults of the surrounding region, and with the cold fusion capability that she had spent generations trying to return to the world that had been denied it. Moldaver led the NCR remnant faction from the observatory with the authority of someone whose historical connection to the Republic's founding period gave her a legitimacy that no currently living person could challenge. She had known the NCR when it was a functioning civilization. She had watched its destruction, a destruction she attributed, with evidence to support the attribution, to Vault-Tec's deliberate intervention. The raid on Vault 33, the taking of hostages, the deaths of people who stood between her and the cold fusion device. These were actions she undertook with the certainty of someone who had calculated the cost and accepted it. Her cruelty is the cruelty of a cause that remained, after the person carrying it had been hollowed out by the weight of carrying it for so long. She is among the television series' most precise portraits of what extended commitment does to the person committed. Not corruption exactly, but erosion. The slow removal of the parts that would have asked whether the methods remained proportionate. The Los Angeles wasteland carries a particular quality of horizontal light in the late afternoon, a sun-bleached flatness that makes every ruin look like it has always been a ruin, as though the collapse were not an event, but a permanent condition of the landscape. Cooper Howard became the ghoul through a process that the first season of the Fallout television series documents in parallel timelines. The pre-war actor, whose public image was built on a specific version of American optimism, and the post-war bounty hunter, whose survival across 2 centuries had required the development of capacities the pre-war version would not have recognized as his own. His cruelty is real, and it is documented across both seasons in specific actions. People pursued, people killed, methods applied with the efficiency of someone for whom the calculation has long since been completed. What the series takes care to maintain alongside this documentation is the architecture of how he arrived here. The betrayal by Vault-Tec, the loss of his family to the organization his wife had served, the specific quality of a man who discovered that the world he had represented professionally had been designed to end by the people funding his career. He is a villain, and he is a record of what was done to him. The series holds both without resolving the tension between them. Vault 4's position in the Season 1 narrative is that of a location the central characters pass through. A vault with a functioning population, a complex internal history, and an overseer whose management choices accumulated into the conditions that the visitors encountered. The overseer of Vault 4 administered an experiment involving mutagenic exposure to her population and continued that administration with the awareness, documented in accessible records, of what the exposure was producing. The television series treatment of this figure is distinguished from the game's approach to similar overseers by the choice to show her as a person with a face and an office, rather than as a presence detectable only in terminal entries. She made decisions one at a time, in a specific room, on a specific chair, with the paperwork in front of her. The decisions accumulated into results that her population lived inside. The series' insistence on showing the administrative face of this process, rather than leaving it as background documentation, is among its most considered formal choices. The games told us what happened in the vaults. The television series showed us the person who made it happen, which required a different kind of attention from the audience. Beneath Los Angeles Wasteland, in Vault 31, Norm MacLean's investigation into the vault's deeper levels revealed a population that had not been surviving the apocalypse so much as sleeping through it. The Buds executives preserved in Vault 31 were not individually characterized across the first season's accessible narrative. They were presented as a collective, a group of suited figures in cryogenic suspension, their faces partially visible through frosted pod windows, their intentions encoded in the program that had kept them frozen and the infrastructure that had kept that program running. Their particular category of villainy is the villainy of preserved intent. These were people whose pre-war decisions had contributed to a catastrophe they had then arranged to sleep through, and whose plan involved waking up once that catastrophe had resolved into conditions manageable enough for their approach to governance to be reimposed. They had not suffered the consequences of what they had authorized. They had scheduled their revival for after the consequences had been absorbed by everyone else. They are villains of anticipation, figures whose most significant acts had not yet been committed when the season concluded, which placed their full accounting in whatever comes next. The New Vegas landscape in Season 2 carries the aesthetic established across decades of game history. The neon, the desert, the specific combination of pre-war commercial ambition and post-war operational reality that makes the Strip unlike any other location in the Fallout universe. The Raider and Bandit leadership figures introduced in Season 2's Mojave setting were operating in the power vacuum created by the NCR's absence and the ongoing instability of the region's competing claims. Their presence in the New Vegas ecosystem is structurally necessary rather than incidental. The city generates resources that attract organized violence, and organized violence, in the absence of sufficient deterrent, generates leadership structures of exactly the kind that Season 2 introduced. The series' approach to these figures reflects the same interest in operational sophistication that characterized its treatment of other wasteland predators. They are not simply present, they are organized, they are managing their operations with the methodical attention of people who have identified a viable revenue structure and are protecting their position within it. Live action allows their physicality a weight that environmental storytelling cannot provide. The specific quality of a person who has built something dangerous and intends to keep it. The pre-war flashback sequences that appear throughout Season 1 carry a specific atmospheric quality. Offices with working lighting, clothing without visible wear, the particular texture of a world where the infrastructure was still intact and the catastrophe was still theoretical. The Vault-Tec handlers visible in those sequences were people whose professional function was the management of the gap between what the program presented publicly and what it was actually designed to produce. They held meetings about this gap. They wrote documents about it. They processed the paperwork through which specific Vault experiments received their authorization. And they maintained, alongside this work, the public communications infrastructure that ensured the people entering those vaults understood themselves to be entering a shelter. The banality of the office environment in which these parallel operations were managed is the season's most considered formal choice. The end of the world was not planned in a dramatic space. It was planned in a building with functioning air conditioning, by people who brought their lunches and checked their schedules and went home at a reasonable hour. Among the figures whose histories connect the pre-war world to its post-war consequences, Barb Howard occupies a position of particular weight in the television series Moral Architecture. She was Cooper Howard's wife, a relationship the series establishes with enough specificity and warmth that the audience registers its reality before the season's revelation reframes it. She was also a Vault-Tec executive who had been participating in the planning of the catastrophe that her husband's public image was, in part helping to mask. She knew what the program was. She made the choice, documented in the pre-war sequences across Season 1, to maintain her institutional loyalty alongside her personal one, to hold both without allowing either to contaminate the other. The season's most carefully constructed moment is not any particular act of violence, but the scene in which Cooper's understanding of what she had been arrives, and where the audience understands simultaneously that the world Barb helped plan was the world that produced the creature standing in front of her. She did not make him. She made the conditions that the making required. The Lucky 38 in Season 2 carries the same exterior the games established. The tower rising above the strip, sealed, its penthouse occupied by a presence that has managed the city's operations for 2 centuries without stepping outside the building. Robert Edwin House's appearance in the television series brings a figure whose villainy has been examined across the games into a format where his physical presence, or the interface through which his presence is mediated, can be rendered directly rather than through the player's screen. The series' treatment of House reflects the same interest in coherent ruthlessness that made him the most intellectually demanding antagonist in Fallout New Vegas. His plan produces outcomes. The outcomes are measurable. The cost at which those outcomes are achieved is distributed across the people of the city he maintains, in ways they were never consulted about and would not have approved had they been asked. He is the television series' clearest example of a villain whose position is not simply wrong, whose arguments have genuine force, and whose cruelty lies specifically in the decision to treat that force as sufficient justification for every consequence it produces. The television series found new ways to render cruelties that the games had examined for decades. What the new medium added was faces, specific individual, legible human faces, attached to decisions that the games had rendered primarily through documentation. The administrators, who were terminal entries, became people with offices. The conspirators, who were implied through records, became people with families. The distance that the game's format had maintained between the decision and the person who made it was, in the series, deliberately closed. What the closing revealed was not that the cruelties were worse than the games had suggested. It was that they had always been this personal, and the documentation had simply been the wrong format for showing it. The faces are new. The cruelties behind them are as old as the franchise. The forgotten figures who follow left no faces at all, only traces in the rubble of what they had done. The Wasteland's most complete historical record is not the one preserved in any single archive. It is the accumulated total of the terminal entries nobody read, the skeletons nobody examined, the rooms whose doors had been jammed long enough that opening them stopped occurring to anyone who passed by. These are the places where the smaller cruelties live, the ones that did not achieve sufficient scale to be named in broadcasts, that did not leave enough survivors to produce an account, that simply happened and were absorbed into the general debris of 200 years of accumulated consequence. Necropolis sits in the Southern California terrain. Its structures partially collapsed, its population reduced across the years since the Great War to a ghoul community that had managed to maintain occupation of the ruins without managing to produce anything that could reasonably be called stability. The city carries the quality of a place that has been declining for so long that decline has become its defining characteristic. Set governed Necropolis through a combination of physical intimidation and the management of perceived threat. His position required the ghoul population to believe consistently that the dangers outside the settlement were severe enough to justify his authority over the resources and operations within it. This required those dangers to remain present, or, where they were not present, to remain credible. He is a minor figure in the first game's broader accounting, his villainy secondary to the Master's organized campaign and the Lieutenant's administrative cruelty. His significance is at the level of principle rather than scale. The person who controls what a community fears controls the community, and the management of fear as a governance tool does not require elaborate infrastructure or advanced technology. It requires only the consistent assertion that what exists outside the walls is worse than what exists within them. Maintained long enough that the population stops checking. South of Necropolis, in the territory that would eventually be associated with Shady Sands and the NCR's early formation, the Khans operated during Fallout 1's timeline. As a raider organization led by a figure whose founding decisions would echo forward through decades of wasteland history, Gal led the Khans with the straightforward cruelty of someone who had identified, in the post-war power vacuum, that organized violence was a more reliable foundation for community than agriculture or commerce, and who had built his organization on that identification. His kidnapping of Tandy, the daughter of Shady Sands founder Aradesh, is among Fallout 1's most direct illustrations of raider operations at the individual level. A specific act of violence against a specific person, conducted for the leverage it provided. He is not a complex figure in the game's own accounting. His complexity arrives retrospectively through what happened to the organization he founded after he was gone. The decimation at Shady Sands, the Bitter Springs massacre, the formation of the Great Khan's identity around the accumulated weight of those defeats. Gal is the first decision in a chain whose final consequences were still being felt 2 games later. Further north, in the terrain near Gecko and Vault City, the settlement of Broken Hills had constructed something genuinely unusual. A community whose population included humans, ghouls, and super mutants operating within a shared governance structure, sustained by a uranium mine that provided the economic foundation for the arrangement. The slavers who targeted Broken Hills were not drawn by its mineral resources. Their interest was ideological rather than commercial. The settlement's existence as a functioning cooperative between species that the wider wasteland treated as incompatible was, in their framework, a challenge to the assumptions their business model depended on. A world in which ghouls and super mutants and humans governed shared infrastructure together was a world with fewer categories available for exploitation. They are unnamed in the historical record. Minor figures whose documentation runs to a few lines in Fallout 2's regional accounting. The detail that justifies their inclusion here is the specific target they chose. They did not raid Broken Hills because it was weak. They raided it because it was working. East, across the country, in the irradiated territory of the former Mid-Atlantic, Evergreen Mills occupies a position along the capital region's western approaches that the raider organization using it had converted from a pre-war industrial facility into something that reflected a specific understanding of how authority was communicated. The behemoth in the reinforced cage near the entrance was not there by accident. Someone had identified and captured an apex predator, a super mutant behemoth representing the largest and most dangerous variant of the mutation, and had constructed adequate containment for it and maintained that containment across enough time for it to become a fixture of the compound's identity. The investment this represented in resources and organizational attention was significant. The decision to make that investment reflected a considered judgment about what the presence of a caged behemoth communicated to anyone approaching the compound. It communicated scale. It communicated organizational capacity. It communicated that the people inside had caught something the wasteland considered uncatchable and had chosen to keep it rather than use it. The cage is the record. The record is the only documentation of a cruelty that required months of planning. In the pit, where the industrial infrastructure of Pittsburgh had been converted into a functioning slave economy, the named figures. Ashur, his wife, the quest-relevant personalities, occupied the visible positions in the historical record. The unnamed figures occupied the positions that made the record's events possible. The foremen managing the steel yard's labor operations were not operating on their own initiative. They were implementing shift requirements, punishment protocols, and production targets that had been authorized at higher levels, and that depended for their execution on the specific daily decisions of people who were close enough to the work to see its human consequences. Their dialogue, where it exists, concerns compliance and output. They are the operational layer of an economy built on forced labor. The people who turned Ashur's strategic choice into the specific daily experience of the people working the mills. Without them, the pit's economy was a concept. With them, it was a functioning system. They are not remembered. They are present in the physical layout of the facility and in the conditions that the facility's history records, which is a form of documentation that does not require names. Salem, in the northeastern reaches of the Commonwealth, carries the atmosphere of a location whose historical associations the surrounding culture never fully processed. A town whose name carries weight that the post-war settlement built on its ruins had not inherited. The raider leadership that occupied Salem's structures left behind a physical arrangement that the released game presents primarily as environmental detail. Bodies positioned in ways that suggest conflict, structural modifications that imply an organizational intent, resource distributions that indicate a settlement that had been developing in a specific direction before that development ended. The fuller narrative that the location's layout suggests. The political history, the internal conflict, the specific character of the leadership that had been building something here, exists in the gap between what the physical evidence implies and what the accessible record confirms. Salem's ghost narrative is the shape of a story that was not quite completed, visible in its outlines through the arrangement of what was left when the completion stopped. Jacobstown, in the Spring Mountains west of the New Vegas Strip, represented one of the Mojave's most deliberate experiments in post-war community building. A settlement established by Marcus, specifically as a place where supermutants and nightkin could exist without the constant threat of extermination that defined their relationship with most of the region. Keen was a nightkin whose prolonged use of stealth boys, the personal cloaking devices that nightkin had relied on during the Master's Army's operational period, had produced the neurological deterioration that extended stealth boy exposure caused in super mutant brain chemistry. His aggression toward humans, his opposition to Marcus's governance, and his destabilizing influence on Jacobstown's internal stability were real and documented. They were also the product of a condition he had not chosen and could not have anticipated. He is a genuine threat to a community that represented something worth protecting. He is also the specific kind of victim that the Fallout universe returns to regularly. The person damaged by a technology that was deployed without adequate consideration of its long-term effects on the people required to use it, who then became a problem that the people around him had to manage without being permitted to acknowledge the origin of the problem. Andale sits along a stretch of pre-war suburban road in the Eastern Territory. Its houses still standing, its yards still maintained, its residents available on the porch in the afternoon, with the particular warmth of people who have not had many visitors and who are pleased to have the company. The families of Andale had been murdering travelers for food across multiple generations by the time the broader history of the region became accessible. The practice had been normalized to the point where the community's children were participants in the domestic routines surrounding it without understanding those routines as unusual. The horror of Andale is not dramatic in the way that the Fallout universe's larger cruelties are dramatic. It is domestic. The dinner table, the welcoming manner, the insistence that the neighborhood was the finest one anywhere. All of this functioned as the surface layer of a practice so thoroughly embedded in daily life that it had stopped requiring justification or acknowledgement. The children set the table. They did not know what the table was for. They would have learned in time the way children in Andale always did. The forgotten ones are not forgotten because their acts were minor. Several of them produced consequences that outlasted every named figure in the region's accounting. They are forgotten because the Wasteland's archive has limited space, and the space was allocated to the organizations and the ideologies and the battles that left enough survivors to construct a record. The smaller cruelties, the ones conducted in single rooms, in unnamed settlements, in the gap between what the official history noticed and what it did not, filled the space between those records and were absorbed into the general texture of how the wasteland felt to live in. The villains have been named, all 127 of them, across regions and eras and mediums. What comes next is not another name. What comes next is the question of what 127 figures, taken together, actually say about the world that produced them. The Lucky 38 is visible from most of the strip at night. The tower rising above everything else, its lights consistent and uninterrupted across 2 centuries of a world that has not managed to interrupt very much else, with comparable reliability. From the penthouse level, the view extends past the boulevard, past the settlements at the Mojave's edges, into a darkness broken only by fires and the occasional pre-war installation, still drawing power from sources that were designed to last. This is where the journey ends. Not in a vault or a military installation or a ruined city. Here, above the lights, where the full distance of what has been traveled tonight is visible in every direction. All the locations, all the figures, all the quiet and not so quiet decisions that produce the wasteland spread out below. 127 figures. The number is arbitrary in the way that all counts are arbitrary. The wasteland contains more than 127 people who did terrible things, and the boundaries between a villain worth naming and a villain absorbed into background texture were drawn by practical necessity rather than moral precision. But the 127 examined tonight were chosen for what they collectively suggest. And what they collectively suggest is worth sitting with before the lights go down. The bombs did not produce cruelty. This is perhaps the most consistent observation available across the full span of the Fallout universe's history. The cruelties documented tonight, the vaults designed before the bombs fell, the corporate plans approved in pre-war conference rooms, the institutional frameworks for eliminating unwanted populations authorized through pre-war governmental channels, were all in place before the first warhead detonated. The bombs removed the infrastructure that had been managing those cruelties. They removed the competing institutions, the legal structures, the social contracts and economic incentives that had been negotiating with human destructiveness and keeping most of it below the threshold of visibility. What remained when those structures were gone was the thing that had always been there. The wasteland did not create its worst figures. It revealed them. Richard Gray fell into a chemical vat and became something that spent decades building an army from other people's biology. And when confronted with the logical failure of his vision, he stopped. This matters. Among 127 figures, the capacity to stop when confronted with evidence is rare enough to distinguish the figures who possess it from those who do not. The master possessed it. His intelligence was sufficient to process a refutation. Most of the others in this accounting were not characterized by similar flexibility. Caesar had read the history and chosen the most brutal available interpretation, and never revised the choice. Father had grown up inside an institution and never been given sufficient cause to question the institution's premises. Elder Elijah had moved, one logical step at a time, from a position of genuine competence and genuine organizational responsibility to a plan to poison the remaining population centers of the Mojave. Each step had been defensible in isolation. The destination was not visible from any single step. It was only visible from out the sequence, looking back. Caesar was dying when the courier found him. A brain tumor progressing in the skull of a man whose entire ideology was organized around physical dominance and historical permanence. The Legion was built around a single mind that was failing. Lanius, who would have inherited command, was a military instrument of considerable effectiveness, and no philosophical framework capable of sustaining what Caesar had built. The empire was larger than its founder and no more durable. This is the observation that applies across every ambitious structure in the Fallout universe's history. The Brotherhood of Steel, the Institute, the Enclave, the NCR, the Legion, all of them larger than the individuals who designed them, all of them no more durable than those individuals' capacity to hold the contradictions of their own positions together. The wasteland is full of ruins that were once certainties. Father, the adult Sean, the Institute's director, the biological son of the sole survivor, was taken at 6 months of age and raised inside an organization that treated the Commonwealth's population as a management problem. He had no reference point outside the Institute's framework. He grew into a man who looked at the ruins above and saw, with genuine accuracy, that they were brutal and ungoverned, and that the Institute's capabilities could have addressed some of what made them brutal. He was right about that. He was wrong about the cost, and about who was bearing it, and about whether his assessment of the situation was sufficiently complete to justify the decisions made from it. He died believing the institution had been worth what it cost. He had spent his entire life inside the institution and had never been outside it long enough to understand what the cost had actually meant to the people paying it. Ulysses stood at the end of the divide, with a flag belonging to a country that had been gone for 2 centuries. He had destroyed the divide deliberately, as a lesson he intended the courier to come and learn. He could be reached through conversation, through patient engagement with the framework he had constructed for his actions. This possibility is among the most carefully preserved in the entire accounting of the Mojave's history. That even the most thoroughly reasoned, most philosophically committed figure can be redirected through language. The wasteland produces people who destroy things to make points. It also occasionally produces the conversations that make the destruction stop. Both of these are documented facts about what the wasteland is capable of. Hank McLean descended back into the vault at the end of the first television season, unhurried, unconfronted, the Vault-Tec infrastructure intact around him, and the consequences of what he had authorized still settling into the landscape above. His daughter was alive and processing what he was. His son held knowledge he had not yet acted on. The second season continued his story. What the first season established was a man who had not been stopped, who had walked back into the systems that made him, and was already oriented toward whatever those systems required next. He is the television series' clearest statement about the nature of the Fallout universe's central problem. The things that produced the catastrophe were not destroyed by it. They were preserved in vaults and bunkers and cryogenic suspension, and they were waiting for conditions to improve enough to resume. Robert Edwin House looked down on the strip from the lucky 38 penthouse and saw a city that was, by every operational metric, maintained through his systems, protected through his securitrons, sustained by his 2-century-old calculations about what a functioning post-war civilization required. The New Vegas ending that follows his route produces measurable outcomes. The cost at which those outcomes are achieved is distributed across everyone in the city who was never consulted about whether the arrangement was acceptable. He is the most coherent villain in this entire accounting, the one whose arguments are most difficult to dismiss, whose plan produces the most verifiable results, and whose cruelty is most precisely located in a single decision that he made long ago and has never revisited. That the people of his city were variables in his calculation, rather than participants in their own futures. Coherence in his case is not comfort. It is the most refined possible form of the problem. The Vault-Tec Executive Board authorized everything. They are the origin point, not of cruelty itself, which is older than any corporate structure, but of the specific organized cruelty documented tonight. The vaults, the experiments, the FEV program, the geological survey that located the warhead sites, the planning documents that mapped the catastrophe in advance. All of it passed through a boardroom in Washington and was stamped with whatever approval was required and filed. The filing cabinets are in the ruins. The terminal entries are still legible. The wasteland that exists tonight, in all the locations visited across these chapters, is the physical consequence of those approvals. 200 years of settling into the landscape. And now the account reaches its final entry. Not a villain, but the person who has spent this quiet time in the company of 126 of them. Every Fallout game places the player in a world of documented cruelty and asks them, through the structure of its choices, to decide what to do within it. The games are interested in that decision. This format is interested in something quieter, in the space that opens up when the urgency of deciding is removed. when the wasteland can be examined from a sufficient distance that its patterns become visible rather than overwhelming. From the penthouse of the Lucky 38, looking out across the lights of a city that has survived through means it never fully disclosed to its residents. That distance is available. The strip is quiet at this hour. The desert beyond it is quieter still. The 127 figures documented tonight were not accidents of a broken world. They were products of the same impulses toward control, toward certainty, toward the conversion of other people's lives into instruments of larger purposes that characterized the world before the bombs fell. The bombs removed the management. They did not remove the thing being managed. Sleep well. The wasteland will still be there when morning comes. It always is. The lights of the Lucky 38 remain on through the night, as they have for 2 centuries, casting their particular quality of illumination across a boulevard that has seen everything this account has described, and has continued regardless. Whatever produced those lights, whatever was traded for them, whatever was decided in sealed rooms and boardrooms and vaults to keep them burning. At this hour, from this height, they are simply light against the dark, and the dark is very quiet, and the quiet is enough.